They arrested the wrong man. And the worst part? Every single person in that ballroom already knew it. They just didn't care enough to say so out loud. Because when a man shows up to a black tie gala in a jacket that doesn't quite fit, carrying a 9-year-old girl on his arm instead of a champagne flute, people have already written his story before he opens his mouth. This is what happened the night Mason Carter walked into the Vantage Tower Grand Ballroom and walked out carrying something none of those people could ever buy. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The invitation had been sitting on Mason Carter's kitchen counter for 11 days before he finally decided to go. It wasn't a fancy invitation. No embossed lettering, no gold foil, no thick cream cardstock the way those events usually sent. It was a standard printout, the kind that comes out slightly crooked because the printer tray is always a little off-center. Emma had taped it to the refrigerator first, then moved it to the counter when she decided the refrigerator was too casual for something this important. She was 9 years old and already had opinions about where documents belonged. "Daddy, it says business casual. What does that mean for me? It means you wear something nice, but you can still breathe in it. So not the blue dress." Not the blue dress. She'd worn the green one instead. Dark green with small white buttons down the front, the hem sitting just below her knees, white tights underneath because the forecast said 52 degrees and Emma ran cold. Mason had pressed it the night before while she was asleep, standing in the kitchen at 11:15 with the ironing board wedged between the counter and the wall, trying not to wake her. The apartment was small enough that you had to be deliberate about noise. He hadn't been planning to go, not really. He'd been planning to drop Emma off, let someone escort her inside and sit in the car reading. That had been the plan for about a week and a half. Then Emma had looked at him over breakfast 3 days ago and said, very matter-of-factly, "You should come inside, I want you to see it on the wall." And that was the end of that plan. The painting was called Shelter. Emma had made it in her after-school art program, the one that ran Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at the community center on Delancey Street, the one Mason paid for with the $37 a month he'd negotiated down from $62 after explaining his situation to the program coordinator. The coordinator, a woman named Patrice with reading glasses she never actually wore but always had pushed up on her head, had looked at him for a long moment and then said 37. And that had been the end of that negotiation too. Shelter showed a man standing in the rain. The rain was painted in thin diagonal lines, dozens of them, patient and deliberate in the way only a child who is actually paying attention can paint. The man had a dark umbrella, and he was holding it not over himself but over a smaller figure beside him, a child, the outline rough but recognizable, the kind of figure you don't misread. The man in the painting was getting soaked. The child was dry. Emma had never explained the painting to Mason. He hadn't asked her to. It had been selected, out of over 200 submissions from after-school programs across the city, for the charity exhibition at Vantage Tower's annual technology gala. The foundation arm of Vantage Global, a company Mason had heard of the way you hear about things that exist in a different atmosphere than your own, had partnered with 12 youth arts programs to feature work alongside their product launch celebration. The gala was ostensibly a technology showcase. The charity exhibition was real, though. Mason had checked. He parked on a side street 4 blocks from Vantage Tower because the parking garage attached to the building was $30, and he needed that $30. Emma didn't ask why they were walking. She already knew why they were walking. She held his hand and counted the cracks in the sidewalk under the orange glow of the street lamps, and Mason carried the small program she'd been mailed, also slightly crooked from a misaligned printer, with her name listed under the exhibition artists. Emma Carter, age 9, Community Arts Initiative. He'd read her name on that program approximately 40 times. The Vantage Tower Grand Ballroom occupied the entire 3rd floor of a building that was trying very hard to make you feel small. Glass and steel and a lobby ceiling that rose 4 stories, with a reception desk staffed by 2 young women in identical blazers who looked at Mason's jacket, a dark navy thing he'd owned since before Emma was born, slightly short in the sleeve now because he'd lost weight he hadn't been trying to lose, and then looked at Emma and then smiled at Emma with the specific warmth that skips the adult entirely. "Are you one of our artists tonight?" the one on the left asked. Emma nodded with the particular gravity of someone who has been waiting to be asked that question. Your painting is right near the entrance to the main exhibition space. You can't miss it. I know, Emma said. It's called Shelter. I know, the woman said. I've walked past it twice already. Mason signed them in, clipped the guest lanyard around Emma's neck, and declined one for himself because the clip was broken and he didn't want to be the person whose lanyard kept falling off all night. He held it in his hand instead. Nobody noticed, or if they did, they didn't say anything. The ballroom was already 3/4 full when they arrived, which was 45 minutes after the doors opened, which was itself 30 minutes later than Mason had originally planned, because Emma had insisted on rebraiding her hair at the last minute, and Mason's braiding skills were, charitably speaking, functional. The room smelled like something expensive, not cologne exactly, more like the idea of expensive, the way hotel lobbies in certain tax brackets have a scent that doesn't correspond to any single product. Round tables with white tablecloths. Centerpieces that were sculptural rather than floral, angular things in brushed silver that Mason couldn't quite identify. Wait staff moving in practice patterns carrying glasses of something pale and sparkling on flat trays. At the far end of the room, a low stage with a podium, and behind it, a screen displaying the Vantage Global logo in slow rotation, a stylized V intersecting a globe, the whole thing rendered in deep blue and silver. Along the right wall, the exhibition. Emma found her painting in 11 seconds. Mason knew because he counted. It was hung at her eye level, which someone had done deliberately, which he noticed and filed away. The frame was simple, dark wood, no ornamentation. The painting looked different on the wall than it had looked on the kitchen table where she'd made it. Bigger, somehow. More serious. The rain lines caught the light and threw small shadows. Emma stood in front of it for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "They hung it a little crooked." Mason looked. She was right. A degree or two off level, tilting almost imperceptibly to the left. "It's barely noticeable," he said. "I notice it." "I know you do." She looked at it for another few seconds. "It still looks good, though." "It looks great, Em." She reached up and straightened it herself. 2 fingers on the lower right corner of the frame, the slightest adjustment, and then stepped back and nodded once, satisfied, the way people do when they've corrected something small, and the world is now in better order. They walked the rest of the exhibition together, Emma narrating the other paintings in a low voice, not unkindly, but honestly. That one is too much blue. That one is sad, but not the good kind of sad. That one, I like that one. That's Marcus from my program. He does really good trees. Mason listened and responded and watched the room out of the corners of his eyes the way he still did in crowded spaces, not anxiously exactly, more as habit. 11 years of a certain kind of work leaves marks that don't entirely go away. He hadn't been thinking about Vantage Global. He hadn't been thinking about the technology launch happening at the front of the room, or the product that was apparently being unveiled tonight. Something to do with biometric security, the program mentioned it in vague corporate language, or any of the people in the expensive clothes who were circulating between the exhibition and the cocktail tables. He'd been thinking about whether Emma wanted to try one of the small appetizers that kept circling past them on trays, and whether the drive home would hit the construction on Millbrook Avenue, or whether they could avoid it by going up through the park. That's what he'd been thinking about when the lights went out. Not all at once. It happened in sequence. The main chandeliers first, dropping the ballroom into a dimness softened only by the ambient glow of the display screens, which then flickered and died as well, plunging everything into a dark that was surprisingly complete for a room full of people. Then the stage lights. Then the backup accent lighting along the walls. Then even the green emergency exit signs buzzed twice and went dark, which they weren't supposed to do, which meant something was wrong below the surface level fuse issue. The sound that 300 people make when a room goes completely dark is interesting. It's not screaming, it's a collective inhale, a suspension, followed almost immediately by dozens of phone flashlights clicking on and creating a low constellation of white light from waist height. Emma grabbed his hand. Not in panic. Emma didn't panic, she analyzed, but with the firm grip that meant I'm locating you. Power failure, she said. Yeah. The exit signs went out too. I know. That's not supposed to happen. No, Mason said. It's not. Around them, the 300 people who'd paid $5,000 a plate to be here were reacting with varying degrees of elegance. Near the stage, someone, Mason could make out the outline, female, authoritative posture, the bearing of someone who was used to walking into rooms where things happened, was already speaking to a man with an earpiece. Her voice carried without being raised, which was its own skill. Get building maintenance on the line, not their night crew. I want whoever handles the electrical infrastructure directly. Ms. Sterling, they're already... Then get me someone who can actually fix it. Victoria Sterling. Mason recognized the name from the program, where she was listed as CEO and founder of Vantage Global, age 30, and from the photo that had run in a business magazine Emma had once picked up at the dentist's office waiting room and read with focused interest because she read everything. The photo had shown a woman who looked like she'd been born standing slightly forward, like she was always about to say something. The woman near the stage looked exactly like that photo. Mason said to Emma, "Stay right here." "Where are you going?" He didn't answer her immediately because he was already moving, not toward the stage, but toward the east wall, where there was a door marked staff access that had been propped open earlier by a waiter who'd come through carrying a tray, and apparently never come back to let it swing closed. Behind that door, Mason had noticed earlier, because he noticed things like this, automatically, without deciding to, there was a gray metal junction box mounted at shoulder height. He wasn't supposed to know what was in it. He knew anyway. The electrical distribution in a building like this was designed with redundancy, but the redundancy depended on a relay system in the subpanel that was, in Mason's assessment from approximately 3 seconds of observation during their arrival, a 2009-era Siemens installation that had probably last been serviced during the previous tenant's occupation. The kind of panel where, if the main draw spiked and the relay failed to throw, everything downstream would die simultaneously, including systems like emergency lighting that were supposed to be on independent circuits. The junction box was locked. Standard padlock, the kind with a 4-digit combination, the kind that building facilities departments set to 0000 or 1234 because the people who used them every day didn't want to think about combinations. He tried 0000. Nothing. He tried 1234. The lock opened. Inside the box, 3 rows of breakers and a relay switch the size of his fist, currently showing a red indicator light on the secondary backup circuit, the line that fed the emergency systems. The primary had tripped. The secondary had failed to engage because something, a corroded connector most likely, this was an old panel in a building that had been renovated rather than rebuilt, had shorted the automatic engagement. Mason took off his jacket, laid it over a nearby cart, rolled up his sleeve, and manually reset the relay. The emergency exit signs came back on first, then the backup lighting along the walls. It wasn't full power. That would take the building's engineering team, but the ballroom was no longer dark, and the exit signage was live, which was what mattered if something actually went wrong. He was back through the staff door and standing beside Emma in under 4 minutes. "The exits are back on," Emma observed. "Yep. You fixed it. Part of it." She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to ask something or file it away. She filed it away. Around them, the room had shifted from quiet alarm to murmured relief. And within 8 minutes, the main power was restored by what turned out to be an actual building engineer who'd been reached by phone, guided in part by the restored emergency system that gave him access confirmation through the secondary circuit. The chandeliers came back on. The stage screens rebooted. A smattering of applause from the crowd, directed nowhere in particular. The night resumed. Mason retrieved his jacket from the cart near the staff door, shrugged it back on, and found Emma already back at the exhibition wall, showing her painting to an older couple who'd stopped to look at it. He stayed back and watched. Emma explained the rain lines, she explained the umbrella. She didn't explain the figures, she just let them look. And the woman in the couple pressed her hand to her sternum and said something Mason couldn't hear, and Emma nodded seriously. He was standing there watching his daughter talk about her painting when he felt the hand on his shoulder. It was heavy, official. He turned. The man behind him was in his 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a well-tailored suit that didn't quite hide the tightness across his shoulders that comes from a certain professional disposition. He had the face of someone who'd spent a career being believed without question. Behind him stood two uniformed officers Mason hadn't seen come in. "Mason Carter!" The entire ballroom didn't go silent right away. It went silent in a wave, the way silence moves in a room when something wrong enters it, starting at the point of origin and radiating outward as people turn to look. "Yes," Mason said. "I'm Elliot Graves, legal counsel for Vantage Global. I'm going to need you to come with me." "Why?" Graves reached into his jacket and produced a clear evidence bag. Inside it was a small device, matte black casing, roughly the size of a thick deck of cards, with a Vantage Global serial sticker along the side and a biometric reader on its face. "This was recovered from your jacket," Graves said. "This is a classified security prototype worth approximately $4.2 million that went missing from our secure display case at 9:47 this evening." The wave of silence completed its circuit. The entire ballroom was quiet. Mason looked at the device in the bag. Then he looked at Graves. Then he looked at the two uniformed officers, who had moved to either side of him with the practiced calm of people doing something they'd done many times. "That wasn't in my jacket," Mason said. "The device was discovered by our security team during a sweep of the access corridor adjacent to the East Staff entrance. Your jacket was located—" "My jacket was on a cart," Mason said, "near the East Staff door for about 4 minutes, while I was resetting your secondary relay circuit." Graves studied him. "Our security team recovered the prototype from the interior breast pocket of a Navy jacket found on that cart. We have your name on the guest manifest. We have a physical description matching you. A lot of people own Navy jackets." "Sir," one of the officers said. "Not unkindly, just procedural." Mason turned to look at Emma. She was standing at the exhibition wall and she had stopped talking to the older couple. And she was looking at him with very still eyes that were doing the thing they did when she was trying to understand something that didn't make sense yet. He held her gaze for exactly long enough to communicate something without words. "Stay there." "I'm fine. Stay there." She didn't move. He turned back to Graves and the officers. "I'm not going to make a scene," Mason said. His voice was even. Not performing calm, actually calm. The kind that comes from having been in rooms considerably worse than this one. "My daughter is 9 years old, and she's standing 20 feet away, and her painting is on that wall. And this is her night. So I'll come with you quietly, and we'll sort this out, and I'd appreciate it if we do this without the theatrics." Graves blinked. He'd been expecting something else. Defensiveness, agitation, the particular energy of a guilty man or a cornered one. He got neither. "All right," Graves said. I want someone to stay with my daughter. We can have a staff member. Someone she can see, not hidden. Someone standing near her where she can look across the room and see them." Mason paused. "She worries when she can't see people." Graves, to his credit, nodded once and signaled someone with an earpiece, who relayed something quietly, and within 30 seconds, a woman in a blazer, one of the reception staff from downstairs, appeared near the exhibition wall and smiled at Emma with the particular warmth that had nothing performance in it. Emma looked at Mason. Mason gave her one nod. She turned back to her painting. Mason walked with Graves and the two officers toward the security conference room on the third-floor mezzanine. He walked without being guided because he knew the layout of the building from arrival. He always knew the layout, and because he didn't need to be held by the arm to walk in a direction. The whispers started as he moved through the crowd. He heard them. He always heard them. The acoustics of a ballroom are better than people realize. Did he steal something? That's the man who was fixing the wiring. I knew something was off about him the moment he walked in. Poor kid. Which one is his daughter? He didn't turn. He didn't stop. He kept his chin level and his hands loose at his sides, and he walked the 43 steps to the door at the back of the mezzanine, and he thought about Emma's painting. The man in the rain, the umbrella tilted not over himself, but over the small figure beside him, the rain coming down in thin, patient lines. He thought about the fact that Emma had never explained who that man was. He thought about the secondary camera in the east corridor, the one mounted at ceiling height near the staff access door junction box, the one that had been showing a dead red indicator light when he'd passed it earlier, which meant it was offline. which meant its feed was probably logging to a buffer nobody was monitoring. He'd noticed it in passing because he noticed things in passing. He'd also noticed, when he'd manually reset the relay in the junction box, that the camera's power lead was tied into the secondary circuit, which meant when he'd restored the secondary circuit, the camera had come back on. He'd been standing directly in front of that junction box for 4 minutes. He'd been the only person there, and if the buffer had been logging even without active monitoring, it would have recorded everything in that corridor from the moment power was restored, including whatever had happened to his jacket. He sat down in the security conference room and folded his hands on the table and waited. Outside, through the glass partition, he could see the ballroom lights burning bright and steady, the crowd reconstituting its earlier rhythms, champagne resuming its circuit. He could see, at an angle, the far edge of the exhibition wall. He couldn't see Emma's painting from here, but he could see Emma. Small, dark-braided, standing very straight with her hands clasped behind her back the way she stood when she was being patient. She was looking toward the conference room. He raised 2 fingers from the table, a small gesture, barely visible through the glass. She raised 2 fingers back. "Mr. Carter?" Graves settled into the chair across from him, tablet in hand, 2 officers flanking the door. "I'd like to start with some basic questions." Mason looked at him. Elliot Graves was good at what he did. Mason could see that. The posture, the measured tone, the way he laid the tablet on the table with the screen angled just enough that Mason couldn't read it. All of it said, "I have done this many times, and I am in control of this conversation." He had the kind of confidence that came from being right most of the time. He was also, Mason was beginning to suspect, either deeply compromised or very conveniently positioned. "Before you start," Mason said, "I'd like to ask one thing." Graves paused. "What's that?" "The camera in the east corridor, the secondary unit, ceiling mount near the staff access door. Before anyone reviews anything, before any conclusions are drawn," Mason kept his voice completely level, "I'd like you to pull that feed, whatever it recorded from 9:40 to 9:50 this evening." Graves studied him. "That camera has been offline for weeks," Graves said. "There's no usable footage." "Pull it anyway," Mason said quietly. "Please." Something passed across Graves's face, something quick and controlled, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, which Mason was. "Please," Graves repeated, almost to himself, as if the word itself had surprised him. "Pull the feed," Mason said, "before you make a mistake you can't take back." Graves set his pen down on the table. The conference room was very quiet. Outside, through the glass, the gala continued in its expensive, oblivious rotation. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loudly near the stage. The Vantage Global logo turned slowly on the screen, blue and silver, a stylized V intersecting a world. Mason looked at Graves and waited. He was good at waiting. He had been good at it for a long time. Graves didn't pull the feed. Not right away. Not when Mason asked, and not for the 20 minutes that followed, during which he asked his questions in the measured, unhurried way of someone who had already decided on the answer and was building the architecture around it. Where had Mason been between 9:30 and 9:50? Could anyone corroborate his movements near the east corridor? Had he handled the secure display case at any point during the evening? Had anyone asked him to? Did he have any prior knowledge of the Vantage Global security prototype before tonight? Mason answered each question with the same flatness. No performance. No agitation. Just the facts, offered plainly, without elaboration or decoration, which Graves seemed to find more unsettling than defensiveness would have been. "You're very calm," Graves said at one point, not quite as an observation, more as a test. "I know what I did and didn't do," Mason said. "That tends to be calming." Graves wrote something on his tablet. Mason couldn't read it. Outside the glass partition, the gala had adjusted to the news of the arrest, or whatever the room was calling it, because no formal arrest had been made yet, just a detaining for questioning, which everyone in the ballroom understood to be the same thing in a nicer frame. The crowd had shifted its center of gravity, pulling toward clusters of conversation rather than the cocktail tables, the way crowds always do when there's something more interesting than the food. Mason could still see Emma. She was sitting now in a chair someone had brought for her near the exhibition wall, and the woman in the blazer from reception, her name was Diane, Mason had caught it from a badge glimpsed on arrival, was sitting beside her. They appeared to be talking. Emma had her program in her lap, the one with her name listed under the exhibition artists, and she was folding the corner of it back and forth, which was what Emma did when she was working something out in her head. She wasn't crying. He'd been watching for that. She wasn't crying. Graves was mid-question when the conference room door opened. The woman who walked in was Victoria Sterling. Mason had seen her across the ballroom earlier, the authoritative posture, the voice that carried, but up close she was different in the way that people always are when you move from impression to reality. She was younger than she photographed, not in a diminishing way, in the way of someone who'd compressed a lot of years into a short span, and it showed in how she carried herself rather than how she looked. Dark blazer, dark slacks, hair pulled back simply, no jewelry except small gold earrings. The kind of woman who'd made deliberate decisions about not looking like she was trying to look a certain way, which was itself a kind of trying. She looked at Graves first. "Where are we?" "We're in the middle of questioning, Victoria. If you could give us—" "I'm the CEO of this company, Elliot. I'm not waiting in the hallway." She moved to the side of the room, not sitting, just standing. She glanced at Mason with the brief directness of someone conducting an internal assessment. "Mr. Carter?" "Ms. Sterling, I want to be very clear that this is a preliminary process, and we are not—" "Making accusations," Mason said. "I know. Mr. Graves covered that." She looked at Graves. Graves looked at the tablet. "Has he been read his rights?" she asked. "He hasn't been formally arrested." "Then why are there two officers standing at the door?" A pause. Something in the room recalibrated slightly. "The officers are here as a procedural—" "Elliot," her voice was quiet. Not the dangerous kind of quiet that's performing danger, just actual quiet. "Answer the question." Graves set his pen down. Standard precaution given the value of the missing item. Victoria looked at Mason again. The assessment in her eyes was harder to read now, less certain than it had been when she'd walked in, which Mason noted. She was not a person who was easy to read, and she was not trying to be read, but something was working behind her face. "Mr. Carter," she said, "do you understand why you're here?" "Because a prototype worth $4 million was found in a jacket on a cart near a door I was standing next to 40 minutes ago." "That's correct." "And because I'm the easiest explanation in the room," Mason said. Not bitterly, just as a fact. Victoria didn't respond to that immediately. She moved to the chair beside Graves, didn't ask if she could sit, just sat, with the automatic authority of someone who doesn't ask permission in rooms she owns, and folded her hands on the table. "You fixed our electrical system tonight," she said. "Part of it. The secondary relay on the emergency circuit. Building engineering handled the rest." "Nobody asked you to do that." "No." "Why did you?" Mason was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, because he was deciding how much context the answer required. The exit signs were out. There were 300 people in a room with no emergency lighting. My daughter was one of them. I know how relays work. It was a fixable problem, and I was standing next to the fix. Victoria studied him. "What do you do for work, Mr. Carter?" "Maintenance and facilities for a mid-rise on Carver Street. Before that, a few other things." "What other things?" "Federal work. I've been out of that for about 5 years." She didn't press it. She looked at Graves. Graves looked at the table. "Pull the corridor camera," Victoria said. "Victoria, that camera has been—" "I heard what Mr. Carter said about the secondary circuit." She didn't raise her voice. "If the camera was on that circuit and he restored it, there may be footage. Pull it. The system logs should show—" "Elliot." The word landed flat and final. "Pull the camera feed now." There was a silence in the room of approximately 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. Graves reached for his phone, he made a call, said 4 words into it, and set the phone on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man who is keeping his face very still. They waited. Mason looked through the glass at Emma. She had stopped folding the corner of the program. She was looking at the painting on the wall, shelter, the rain lines. The umbrella held not over the man, but over the child. Victoria followed his gaze. "Is that hers?" she asked. "Yes." "It was one of the first ones our foundation committee flagged." She paused. Not my decision. I don't make the selection calls, but I read all the committee notes. They wrote about that painting for almost a full paragraph. That almost never happens. Mason didn't say anything. She painted it herself? Every Tuesday and Thursday. Victoria looked at the painting for another moment. Then she looked at Mason. Something in her assessment had shifted further, though she wasn't going to name it, and he wasn't going to ask her to. The door opened. A young man came in, early 20s, technical department. You could tell by the lanyard and the particular anxiety of someone who'd been asked to do something faster than comfortable. He had a laptop open and angled toward Graves. We pulled the secondary circuit log, he said, slightly breathless. The camera restored at 9:41 and 18 seconds. He set the laptop on the table and turned it so both Graves and Victoria could see. There's a 68-minute buffer from that point. It's there. Graves looked at the screen. Victoria looked at the screen. Mason looked at neither of them. He looked at the window. Play it, Victoria said. What happened next was quiet, in the way that certain kinds of revelation are quiet. Not dramatic, not scored, just a thing being seen by people who hadn't seen it before. Mason didn't watch the playback. He watched Graves. He watched the way Graves's jaw set at a particular moment in the footage. He watched the way the man's right hand, resting on the table, became very still. He watched Graves look at the screen with the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head very fast. Not the arithmetic of guilt exactly, but the arithmetic of contingency, the calculations of a person assessing exits. Victoria made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, low and unfinished, the kind you make when something you understood one way suddenly reveals itself as something else entirely. Elliot, she said. Graves didn't answer. Elliot, look at me. He looked at her. His face had become very careful, very smooth, the kind of smooth that costs effort. That's you, she said. Her voice had gone quiet in a different way than before. In the corridor, that's you with his jacket. Victoria, that's you. Graves stood up. It was a small movement, not dramatic, just a man getting to his feet. The two officers at the door shifted, their attention sharpening without anyone saying a word. I'd like to call my attorney, Graves said. You are an attorney, Victoria said. A different attorney. One of the officers stepped forward. The other moved to the far side of the room with the quiet choreography of people who have done this before. Graves looked at the door. He looked at the officers. He looked at Victoria, whose face had gone through something in the last 45 seconds that would take her a long time to process. The particular devastation of realizing that the person you trusted most in a room full of people was the person who least deserved it. She looked at Mason. He was already looking at her. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting for the room to catch up to what he already knew. The officers handled Graves quickly and without theatrics. One of them spoke into a radio. The other accompanied Graves to the door, which opened and closed with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Victoria sat in the now quiet room with Mason Carter and the open laptop showing a frozen frame of corridor footage, and she said nothing for what felt like a long time. The real prototype, Mason said finally. She blinked. What? Whatever he had in the case for display tonight wasn't the actual device, was it? You wouldn't put the real one on an open table at a public event? Which means the item he put in my jacket was a working replica, and the actual prototype. Mason paused. Where is it normally kept? Victoria was very still. Our secure lab, sub-basement. You might want to check that. She pulled out her phone. She made a call. She spoke for 40 seconds, listened for 30, and then set the phone on the table and pressed both palms flat against the surface like she needed to feel something solid. It's gone, she said. He had time, Mason said. The power failure gave him a window, long enough to lift the real device from wherever it was stored, long enough to put the replica in my jacket and have a narrative ready when anyone came looking. He engineered the power failure. Mason thought about the junction box, the corroded connector, the way the relay had failed to throw automatically, which was unusual. Building systems weren't perfect, but that particular kind of simultaneous cascade failure had a signature to it, the signature of something that had been helped along. Probably overloaded the primary circuit somehow to trigger the failure, Mason said. Planned for the backup to stay down. Didn't plan for someone to know how to bring it back up. He paused. Or for the camera. Victoria looked at the frozen footage on the laptop screen. Graves, in his well-tailored suit, his back to the camera he hadn't known was live, working Mason's jacket with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed it. He's been my legal counsel for 4 years, she said. Her voice had gone flat in the way voices do when the flatness is doing work. He negotiated 3 of our biggest acquisition contracts. He was in every room. That's valuable, Mason said. To the right buyer. A competitor. Probably. And he was going to let you... She stopped. Mason waited. He was going to let you take it, she said. Not as a question. It's a clean frame, Mason said. Unknown man, no connections to the company, found near the door he'd been standing at. Prototype in the jacket. Story writes itself, especially in a room full of people who already decided what I was the moment I walked in. Victoria opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked at her hands on the table. She was not a woman who was comfortable in this specific posture. Not defensive, not aggressive, just sitting with something she didn't have language for yet. I owe you. You don't owe me anything yet, Mason said. Your company almost had me arrested. Let's not call it even until we figure out what happens next. She looked at him sharply. Then, unexpectedly, something in her face relaxed. Not into warmth exactly, but into a kind of honest acknowledgement that the comment deserved. She wasn't used to people talking to her that way. She wasn't deciding how she felt about it. Fair, she said. One of the officers had come back in. A detective too now. Someone from the city, not building security, called when the situation upgraded itself. His name was Harlan Reyes, mid-40s, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had been listening to people tell him things for so long it had developed a permanent expression of patient skepticism. He shook Mason's hand and held it a half-second longer than necessary, which was not something detectives normally did. Mason Carter, Reyes said, with the specific inflection of someone who is working out whether they know that name. Detective Reyes, Mason said. Reyes looked at him for a moment, set something aside in his head. We're going to need your full statement, Reyes said. And we need the complete camera buffer downloaded and secured before anyone touches that system. He looked at Victoria. Ms. Sterling, I'm going to have to ask your tech team to stop what they're doing with that footage until we can establish chain of custody. Whatever you need, Victoria said. We also need to know what we're looking for regarding the missing prototype. Full specs, last confirmed location, access logs for the past 72 hours. I'll have our CTO tonight, Reyes said. Not in the morning. Victoria nodded once. Reyes looked at Mason again. The look of a man who is assembling pieces. You mind if I ask you something, Mr. Carter? Go ahead. When you asked Graves to pull the camera feed, what made you think there was anything on it? Mason considered how to answer that. I knew the camera was on the secondary circuit because I saw the dead indicator light when I came through the corridor, and I knew the secondary circuit was offline because I was the one who brought it back. So I knew the camera came online at the same time I started working the junction box. And you knew Graves was involved? I suspected. Because when he told me the prototype was found in my jacket, he said the security team had discovered it in the interior breast pocket. Standard jacket discovery. Someone picking up an item, checking for ID. You'd check the exterior pockets first. The breast pocket is the last place you check, or the first place you check if you already know what's there. Mason paused. He knew too much about exactly where it was. Reyes looked at him for a long moment. 5 years ago, Reyes said carefully, there was a federal witness protection operation out of the Northern District. One of the lead handlers left the program. Nobody in that office talked about why. He paused. Some of us heard things. Mason said nothing. That was good work, Reyes said, quietly, not elaborating. Thank you, Mason said. Reyes nodded once, the way men nod when they've acknowledged something without saying it out loud, and turned back to the logistics of what the next several hours were going to look like. Victoria Sterling had been sitting through that exchange without speaking. She was good at reading rooms. It was one of the things that had made her successful. And she understood that what had passed between those two men was something she didn't have full access to, and that pressing for access wasn't the right move. She stood. "I need to go back out there." "You should," Mason said. She looked at him. "The officers are going to need to clear you formally. It won't take long given the footage, but it's a process." "I know." "Emma. Emma is fine." Victoria paused at the door. She had her hand on the frame, and she turned back, not quite looking at him, looking at the middle distance the way people do when they're assembling something. "I didn't ask your opinion before I let Elliot take over the investigation," she said. I should have at least—" She stopped. "I moved too fast." "You moved the way most people would have moved," Mason said. "That's not an excuse." "No," he said, "it's not." She held the frame for another second. Then she went. The room was quiet with just Mason and Reyes and a junior officer doing something with cables near the laptop. Reyes sat down across from Mason with a legal pad. Old school. The kind of detective who'd never trusted tablets for notes. "Walk me through the whole evening," he said. "Start from when you arrived." Mason started from when he arrived. It took 40 minutes, and he told it the way he always told things, without embellishment, without editorial, just the sequence of events in order, the details he'd noticed, the conclusions he'd drawn, and when he'd drawn them. Reyes listened with the full attention of someone who had spent enough time hearing bad accounts that he recognized a good one. At one point, Reyes stopped him. "The corroded connector in the relay, you think that was deliberate?" The corrosion looked right, but the way the secondary circuit was configured, someone who knew what they were doing could have accelerated the degradation with the right chemical on the contact surface. Would look like years of natural wear. Would only take weeks. You'd need access to the building's electrical room. Graves would have had building access during the contract review phase of Vantage's lease here. Standard practice, full facility inspection rights. Reyes wrote something, underlined it. "Weeks of planning," he said, half to himself. "Maybe longer," Mason said. This wasn't improvised. Outside the glass, the ballroom had gone quieter. Not empty, but the particular quiet of a room where the ambient anxiety has changed key. The whispers were still running, but they had the quality of whispers that know they're missing information. From where he sat, Mason could see the stage where someone, not Victoria, someone from her team, was speaking in low tones to the group nearest the front. He could see the exhibition wall. He could see Emma, still in the chair Diane from reception had brought her, sitting very straight, looking at her painting with the kind of concentration that meant she was not thinking about the painting at all. She was thinking about him. She was thinking in the patient, methodical way she had developed in the years since it had been just the two of them, turning the problem over, looking for the angle that made it solvable, refusing to arrive at panic before she had the facts. She was 9 years old, and she was better at that than most adults he knew. The thought sat in his chest somewhere. "Mr. Carter," Reyes said. Mason pulled his attention back. "Before we wrap the statement, you mentioned federal work, witness protection specifically. You want to tell me a little about that, or you'd rather it stay on the other side of what we're doing here?" It was a careful question. Reyes was a careful man. "I'd rather keep it separate," Mason said. "It doesn't affect tonight's account." "Fair enough." Reyes tapped his pen on the legal pad. "One more thing, just for my own picture. You walked into this building tonight knowing nobody here. You had no reason to get involved in any of this. You fixed an electrical issue nobody asked you to fix, which is what ended up clearing you. Why?" Mason thought about the exit signs going dark. The 300 people in the room, Emma's hand finding his in the dark. "I know how to fix things like that," he said, "and it needed fixing." Reyes looked at him. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," Mason said. Reyes made a sound that was close to a laugh, but didn't quite complete itself. He wrote one more thing on the legal pad, capped his pen, and stood. "We're going to hold Graves tonight," Reyes said. "The formal charges are going to take a few days to build properly, but the footage is strong. The CTO's access logs are going to be stronger once we pull them, and we're going to be looking hard at whoever he was passing that prototype to." He paused. "You're free to go, Mr. Carter, formally. I'll have the officer at the door note the time." Thank you. Thank you, Reyes said. Mason stood. His back ached slightly, the way it had been aching for the past 6 months, the nagging consequence of a fall he'd taken while fixing a gutter on the Carver Street building in October that he hadn't reported because reporting it meant paperwork, and paperwork meant his supervisor asking questions about whether he was going to file a claim, and Mason didn't want to file a claim. He wanted the gutter fixed and his back to stop bothering him. Neither of those things had fully resolved. He put on his jacket. The evidence tag had been removed. One of the junior officers had handled it while Reyes was working through the statement, and the jacket looked the same as it had when he'd taken it off near the East Corridor door, which was to say it looked the same as it always looked. Navy, slightly short in the sleeve, not quite the right weight for the weather outside. He went to the conference room door and opened it. The officer at the door, young, the kind of young where he was probably still figuring out how to wear the uniform naturally, looked at him. "You're cleared, sir." "Thank you." He walked out into the mezzanine level and down the short flight of steps back to the ballroom floor. The crowd saw him before he saw Emma. He felt it, the way a room's attention redirected, not all at once but in a wave, the same wave as before, but running in reverse, the silence flowing outward from his point of re-entry, heads turning, whispers recalibrating, the particular awkwardness of a room that has already decided something and is now being asked to undecide it. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked for Emma. She was already out of the chair. She was already moving toward him, not running. Emma rarely ran in public. She thought running in public was undignified, and had told him so at age 7 in a tone that brooked no argument. But she was walking fast, arms slightly out, the green dress and the white tights and the dark braids that were coming slightly loose at the ends because it had been a long evening. He crouched down when she was 3 feet away, because kneeling on the ballroom floor of the Vantage Tower Grand Ballroom was not something he was going to worry about. She walked into him. Not dramatic, just decisive. The way she was decisive about things. Arms around his neck, face against the side of his head. He put his arms around her. "Are you okay?" she said into his ear, very quietly. "Yeah, Em. They were wrong." "They were. I knew they were." He pulled back enough to look at her. She was doing the thing with her face where she was being very controlled, and the control was costing her something. "Hey," he said. "I'm fine," she said, the way she said it when she wasn't going to be fine for a little while but had decided that was her own business. "I know." She looked at him for a moment with her serious, old-thinking eyes. "Your jacket is wrinkled." He looked down at it. It was. "It's had a rough night." "Both of you," she said. He laughed. It wasn't a long laugh or a big one, just a real one, the kind that comes out because it can't help it. Emma looked briefly satisfied in the way she looked when she'd said something that landed. He stood up, took her hand. Around them, the ballroom was still processing. He could feel the recalibration happening in real time. The guests who'd watched him walk out with the officers were now watching him walk back in with his daughter's hand in his. And the math they were doing was visible on their faces. The particular arithmetic of people who've been wrong about something and are working out whether to acknowledge it or pretend the original position never existed. Most of them were going to pretend, he knew. That was human nature, and he had no quarrel with human nature. He walked Emma back toward the exhibition wall. Her painting was still there, slightly corrected on its nail from when she'd straightened it earlier, the rain lines catching the light. "Can we stay a little longer?" she asked. He looked at the painting, the man in the rain, the umbrella held over someone else. "Yeah," he said, "we can stay a little longer." She stood beside him and they looked at the painting together, and behind them the ballroom slowly returned to something resembling its former rhythm, and somewhere in the building Elliot Graves was being processed, and Victoria Sterling was making phone calls, and Reyes was building a case that was going to take weeks and end careers, and none of that touched them here. Here was just the painting, the rain, the umbrella, a father and daughter standing in front of something true. They stayed for another 22 minutes. Mason knew the exact number because Emma had his watch. She'd asked to wear it during the drive over, the way she sometimes did, and he'd never gotten it back. And she checked it twice while they stood in front of the painting, not because she was eager to leave, but because Emma was a person who liked to know what time it was. It gave her a sense of where she was in the day. Mason had never discouraged it. The ballroom around them had returned to something approximating its earlier state, but the texture was different. The conversations were quieter. The laughter, when it came with the slightly forced quality of people who were performing normalcy because the alternative was sitting with discomfort, and nobody in a $5,000 a plate ballroom wanted to sit with discomfort. They'd paid good money not to. A few people approached the exhibition wall during those 22 minutes. An older man in a charcoal suit who stood in front of Emma's painting for a long time without saying anything, and then said, to nobody in particular, "Remarkable," and moved on. A woman who asked Emma directly about the rain technique and listened with genuine attention while Emma explained that she'd used a fine-tip brush and done each line separately, which had taken 3 full sessions at the community center and made her hand cramp. The woman said that sounded like real work. Emma agreed that it was. Nobody approached Mason, not directly, but he felt the peripheral attention, the glances from across the room, the conversations that stopped when he moved in a certain direction and resumed when he passed. He was used to being looked at sideways. He'd spent enough of his professional life being someone that other people were trying not to look at directly. It was a different thing, being looked at sideways because people were reassessing you. Still uncomfortable, different flavor. At 8 minutes past 10, Emma said, "Can we get something to eat before we go? The small things on the trays. The appetizers? The ones that looked like little open sandwiches. I don't know if they're still circulating." They were circulating 5 minutes ago. The man in the white jacket went past the east side of the room. Mason looked. She was right. He flagged down the waiter, a young man who was already redirecting toward them before Mason's hand was fully raised, with the alertness of someone who had been watching their section carefully. And Emma selected 3 of the small open-faced things with something dark and savory on top and ate all 3 with the focused efficiency of a child who had not eaten since 5 o'clock and had been too proud to mention it until now. "You were hungry," Mason said. "I was waiting until things were settled," Emma said, with her mouth not quite full but close. He looked at her. "Things are settled now," she added. He didn't say anything. He put his hand briefly on the top of her head, between the braids, the way he'd done since she was small enough to fit in the crook of one arm. She allowed it for approximately 4 seconds before tilting her head away in the manner of a child, asserting that she was in fact 9 and not a baby. They said goodbye to Diane from reception, who had stayed near the exhibition wall longer than her job required, and who shook Emma's hand formally when Emma extended it, which Emma did because she believed in handshakes as a sign of respect, and had believed this since age 6 when she'd read something about it and decided it was correct. Diane seemed genuinely moved by the handshake. She looked at Mason after and pressed her lips together in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was something in the neighborhood. "She's something," Diane said. "I know," Mason said. They were moving toward the exit, Emma with her program tucked under her arm, Mason with his jacket still slightly wrinkled from its evening, when Victoria Sterling appeared from the direction of the stage, moving with the purposeful velocity of someone who had been handling things for the past hour and had one more thing to handle before they could stop. She stopped in front of them. Emma looked up at her with calm, direct eyes. Victoria crouched, not the awkward crouch of someone who didn't interact with children often, but a deliberate one, putting herself at Emma's level, which Mason noticed. "You're Emma," Victoria said. "Yes." "I'm Victoria. I run the company that put your painting on that wall tonight." Emma considered this information. "I know. Your name is in the program." "It is." Victoria paused. "I want to tell you that your painting is extraordinary, and I want to tell you that I'm sorry you had to sit and wait for such a long time tonight while the grown-ups were sorting out their mistakes." Emma was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was processing whether something was sincere or performed. She had a very accurate internal instrument for that distinction. "It's okay," Emma said finally. "My dad was sorting it out too." Victoria looked at Mason over Emma's head. The look lasted about 2 seconds and contained something complicated that neither of them was going to put into words right now. "He was," Victoria said. She looked back at Emma. "Your painting is going to stay up for the full run of the exhibition, 3 more weeks, and I'd like to have a proper framing made for it afterward. Archival quality, so you can keep it." Emma's expression changed. Not dramatically. Emma didn't do dramatic. But there was a shift, the particular brightness that appeared in her face when something mattered to her more than she'd anticipated. "The frame it's in now is fine," she said, which was Emma's way of saying she didn't want to be a burden. "I know it is," Victoria said, "but the painting deserves better than fine." Emma looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." Victoria stood. She and Mason were roughly the same height when she was in heels, which she was, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the middle of the Vantage Tower Grand Ballroom while the remnants of the gala circulated around them, and neither of them said anything. "We'll be in touch about the formal clearance documentation," Victoria said finally. "Detective Reyes said it would be filed by morning." "Okay." "Mason." She used his first name without seeming to decide to. "I'm sorry, properly sorry, not the corporate kind. What happened tonight was complicated," Mason said, "and we're both tired, so let's leave it where it is for now." She opened her mouth, closed it, nodded. He and Emma left. The drive home hit the construction on Millbrook Avenue after all. Mason had hoped to avoid it by going up through the park, but there were cones blocking the park entrance for what appeared to be unrelated overnight maintenance, because the city had a talent for scheduling two different inconveniences on the same evening. They sat in the backed-up traffic for 11 minutes while Emma looked out the window at the construction lights, orange and white, throwing shadows across the lane dividers. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "What's a legal advisor?" Mason thought about how to answer that. "A lawyer who works specifically for a company, advises them on legal questions, protects their interests." So he was supposed to protect the company. Yes. But he was stealing from it. Yes. Emma was quiet for a moment, watching the construction lights. "That's the worst kind of stealing," she said. "When you steal from the people who trusted you." Mason didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to add. "Is he going to jail?" Emma asked. "Probably. Eventually. It takes time." "How much time?" "Months, maybe. Depends on a lot of things." Emma nodded slowly, processing this against whatever internal framework she was building for how justice worked in practice versus in principle. A framework she'd been constructing since she was old enough to notice the gap between the two. The traffic moved. Mason drove. The city outside the windows was doing what it always did at this hour. The late restaurants still lit, the convenience stores bright, a group of people outside a bar laughing at something, ordinary life in all its ordinary motion, indifferent to the fact that inside this particular car, a man and his daughter were both doing the private work of coming down from something. Emma fell asleep before they cleared the bridge. He knew the exact moment it happened because her running commentary, which had been operating at low volume, cataloging the things she saw outside the window, stopped mid-sentence. One moment she was saying, "There's a dog walking by itself. I don't think it's lost, though. It looks too comfortable." And then silence. And in the rear-view mirror, her head had dropped slightly to the left. He drove the rest of the way home in the specific quiet of a car with a sleeping child in it. Upstairs, in the apartment, he carried her from the car to the elevator, and from the elevator to her bed, which he had not had to do in over a year because she'd informed him at age 8 that she was old enough to walk herself to bed. She didn't stir when he laid her down, didn't stir when he took his watch back from her wrist, didn't stir when he pulled the blanket up over the green dress, because undressing her while she was asleep was a complicated enough operation that he'd learned to leave it for the morning. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. The apartment was quiet. The refrigerator ran its low hum. Somewhere outside a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the living room. Everything was the same as it always was at this hour. The same furniture, the same peeling paint on the corner of the baseboard that he kept meaning to fix, the same stack of Emma's library books on the kitchen table because the kitchen table had long since become her primary reading surface and he'd stopped fighting it. The same. And something had happened in it. Something had gone wrong and been corrected, and now it was the same again, but he knew from experience that the same again was never entirely the same. There were things that left marks you couldn't see. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and didn't drink it for a while. He thought about Elliot Graves, the way the man had stood across from him in the conference room with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd spent years being believed. 4 years of Victoria's trust, of being in every room, of knowing every contract and every vulnerability. And he'd sold it. Not in a moment of weakness or desperation. This had been planned, carefully and over a long period, which was worse. Weakness. Mason understood. Planning took a different kind of coldness. He thought about the camera, the dead indicator light he'd noticed in passing and filed away without deciding to. The 4 minutes he'd spent at the junction box. He hadn't known, when he was restoring that relay, that the footage would matter. He'd restored it because the exit signs were out and 300 people were in a dark room, and it was something he could fix. The rest had been luck, or rather the ordinary consequence of paying attention to things. Attention compounding into something that looked like luck from the outside. He thought about Reyes's face when he'd said Mason's name, the particular way a person looks when they're recognizing something they weren't expecting to encounter. He thought about the things he hadn't talked about in 5 years, the work, the reason he'd left it. He wasn't going to think about those things tonight. He'd gotten good at putting them down when the hour was late and Emma was asleep in the next room and the apartment was quiet. He put them down now. He poured the water out and went to bed. The next 10 days moved the way days move after something disrupting, outwardly normal, internally still processing. Mason went to work. He repaired a leaking pipe in 4B and replaced a fuse box on the 6th floor and fixed the elevator door that had been catching on its track for 3 weeks. He picked Emma up from school. He made dinner. He helped with homework, math, which Emma was better at than him, and a history project on the labor movement, which he knew more about than she'd expected, which led to a long conversation over the remains of Tuesday's pasta that ranged through the Pullman strike and collective bargaining and whether unions still made sense in the current economy, during which Emma took notes in the small spiral notebook she kept for things she wanted to remember. Normal life, the specific texture of their normal life, which was not glamorous and was often tight and was, in ways he'd stopped trying to articulate, the thing he'd chosen deliberately and would choose again. On the 4th day, Reyes called. He called in the late afternoon, when Mason was between tasks in the building's basement utility room, and Mason sat on an overturned bucket to take it because the signal was better near the north wall. Graves is charged, Reyes said, formally. Grand theft, corporate espionage, evidence tampering, obstruction. The DA is also looking at conspiracy charges because he didn't do the sub-basement access alone. There was a facilities employee who's cooperating in exchange for reduced exposure. The power failure was deliberate. Confirmed. Someone got into the junction panel about 3 weeks ago and introduced a compound onto the secondary relay connector. Looks like natural corrosion unless you test it. The building's maintenance logs show a routine inspection during that period with access granted to Graves's office during the Vantage lease review. Reyes paused. You were right about all of it. I guessed at most of it, Mason said. Educated guesses, Reyes said, from a man who notices things. Who'd he sell to? Company called Axon Meridian. Competitor in the biometric security space. 3 of our people are on site at their facility right now with a federal warrant. The prototype, the real one, was already in their possession. We recovered it. Another pause. The DA's office is very happy. Vantage Global's board is less happy, for obvious reasons, but that's a different problem. Victoria Sterling, Mason said. She's been cooperative, completely. More than cooperative. She's been ahead of us on most of the documentation. Whatever else she is, she runs a tight company, and she's thorough. Mason thought about Victoria in the conference room. The way she'd said, that's you to Graves, flat and quiet. The 2 words carrying the weight of 4 years of misplaced trust. The way she'd pressed her palms to the table afterward. She was not a person who processed things slowly or messily in public, but she was processing them. Is there anything you need from me? Mason asked. Formal deposition in about 3 weeks. Nothing unexpected, just the statement on record in proper form. I'll have someone contact you to schedule. Reyes paused. There's one more thing. Okay. The night of the gala, when I asked you about your background and you said you'd rather keep it separate. Reyes's voice was careful. the way it was when he was being deliberate. I did some asking around, not in any official way, just asking. Some people I know who work in certain circles. Mason said nothing. What happened to your wife? Reyes said. I'm sorry. I didn't know the full story until I asked. The utility room was very quiet. The building above Mason hummed with its ordinary weight. Elevators, pipes, the accumulated life of 200 residents going about their evenings. Thank you, Mason said. The words came out flat, which wasn't how he meant them, but there was no other register available for that particular sentence in that particular moment. The people I talked to said you were the best handler they'd ever worked with, Reyes said. Said you left because you didn't trust the program anymore after... He stopped. After. And that you'd been off-grid since. More or less. I'm not going to put any of that in the deposition, Reyes said. It's not relevant to the case, but I wanted you to know I know it. So if there's anything that comes up, anything that touches those old circles, you can call me directly. Not through the department, just me. Mason looked at the north wall. The concrete block, the conduit running diagonally up toward the first floor, the small damp stain in the corner that he'd been monitoring for 3 months to determine if it was active or residual. It looked residual. I appreciate that, Mason said. Take care of that kid, Reyes said. Always. Reyes hung up. Mason sat on the overturned bucket for another minute before going back to work. On the 7th day, he got a different call. This one from a number he didn't recognize, a city exchange. And he almost let it go to voicemail because unknown city numbers at 6:15 in the evening were usually either robocalls or wrong numbers. He answered it because Emma was with him in the car, and she'd started a policy of answering unknown calls on the grounds that it might be something important, and ignoring important things was irresponsible. Mason, Victoria Sterling's voice. Direct, without preamble. She'd gotten his number from Reyes, she said, who'd given it to her after she'd asked, and he'd verified with Mason first. She explained all of this quickly, efficiently, the way she did everything. Okay, Mason said. I want to meet with you. Not about the case. Reyes and the legal team are handling all of that. Something separate. A pause. I have a proposal I'd like to discuss. Emma, in the back seat, was not pretending not to listen. She was openly listening, watching him in the rearview mirror. What kind of proposal? Mason asked. The kind I'd rather explain in person. He was quiet for a moment. He could feel Emma's attention like a small, focused weight. Coffee, he said. Not a dinner, not an office meeting. Coffee, somewhere ordinary. Wherever you'd like, Victoria said. You pick. There's a place on Carver, Marcello's, Tuesday at 8 in the morning. I'll be there. She hung up. Emma looked at him in the rearview mirror. Who was that? Victoria Sterling. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing. The CEO. Yes. What did she want? To talk. About what? She didn't say. Emma looked out the window, then back at the mirror. Are you going to go? I said I would. Okay. Emma considered. She was nice to me. About the frame. I know. That doesn't mean her proposal is a good one, Emma said. No, Mason agreed. It doesn't. Marcello's was not the kind of coffee shop that would impress anyone arriving from Victoria Sterling's world. It had 4 tables, a counter with 3 stools, a chalkboard menu that was partly obscured by a support beam, and a coffee machine that made a sound like a large animal clearing its throat before dispensing anything. The owner, Marcello himself, who was in fact named Marcello and had been making coffee on this corner for 21 years, knew Mason's order and had it ready by the time he'd sat down, which was a plain coffee, large, no modifications. Victoria arrived 3 minutes after Mason, which was itself a statement. She'd left enough buffer to not be late, not enough to be early in a way that looked strategic. She was in different clothes than the gala, obviously. Dark jeans, a gray jacket, hair down rather than pulled back. She looked like she'd made an effort to look like she hadn't made an effort, which Mason recognized as its own particular effort. She looked at the coffee machine. The animal clearing its throat sound was happening. What can I get you? Marcello asked from behind the counter, with the warmth he reserved for people Mason brought in. Whatever he's having, Victoria said, nodding at Mason's cup. Marcello looked briefly impressed, in the way of a man who respects a person who doesn't complicate a coffee order. She sat down across from Mason. The table was small enough that there was no comfortable way to arrange yourself across from someone. You were just there, close, without the buffer of a boardroom or a conference table. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "You said you had a proposal," Mason said. "I do." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup when Marcello set it down, which Mason noted. It was a cold morning. The habit said something. "Before I get to it, I need to say something that I should have said better the night of the gala." "You apologized." "I started to." "You cut me off." "I said to leave it where it was." "You did," Victoria said, "but I've been thinking about it for 10 days, and I don't think I should leave it where it was. So I'm asking you to let me say this even if it's uncomfortable." Mason picked up his coffee cup. "Okay." She met his eyes. Hers were steady. Not the performance of steadiness, the actual thing. "I walked into that conference room the night of the gala and I looked at you and I made an assessment before I'd heard you speak. Not a conscious one. The kind you don't catch yourself making because it happens below where you think you are." She paused. "I'm good at reading people. That's a real skill I've built over a long time. But I used it wrong that night. I let the frame decide the content, and the frame was..." She stopped. "The frame was a man who didn't belong in the room," Mason said. "Yes," Victoria said. Not quietly, not apologetically, just directly. It was worse and better than if she'd hedged it. "The frame was a man who didn't fit my picture of the evening, and I walked in already 2/3 convinced by that picture, and I did not do the work of questioning it until the footage was already playing." She looked at her coffee cup. "Elliot had been in my orbit for 4 years. I trusted him completely, and that trust, it wasn't built on evidence, really. It was built on the fact that he'd always been there, and he'd always been right, and he presented himself in a way that I found legible." She looked back at Mason. "You were illegible to me, and I treated illegible as suspect." The coffee machine made its sound. Marcello's back was turned, giving them privacy in the way of someone who'd run a small coffee shop long enough to know when a conversation needed room. "People do that," Mason said. "People do it. I did it." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not going to tell you it'll never happen again in my company because that would be a promise I can't keep. People make these calls every day and most of them don't know they're making them. But I can tell you what I'm doing about it, which is the only honest thing I can offer." "What are you doing about it?" "That's the proposal," she said. She had been thinking about it, she explained, since the night of the gala. Not in the abstract. She didn't operate in abstraction, she said, with the self-awareness of someone who'd learned to know their own processing style, but in specifics. Vantage Global had a foundation arm, the one that had funded the charity exhibition where Emma's painting had been selected. It existed primarily as a tax vehicle and a PR function, she said bluntly. She was not proud of that, but it was accurate. She wanted to change what it did. What she was describing, and she laid it out with the efficiency of someone who'd been building the architecture in her head for days, was a program specifically designed to provide legal and financial protection to workers who were wrongfully accused in their professional environments. Falsely accused employees who couldn't afford the kind of legal response that would actually clear their names. Security clearances challenged on bad evidence. Workers terminated on the basis of assumptions that fit a profile rather than facts. People who disappeared from industries because someone in power had made a call and nobody had pushed back. She'd been on the phone, she said, with 3 employment attorneys, 2 civil rights organizations, and the director of a workforce advocacy nonprofit. She had a structure in mind, a funding commitment from the Vantage Board, and a gap she couldn't fill from inside the company. "What gap?" Mason said. "Someone who knows how these situations actually work from the inside," Victoria said. "Not legally. On the human side. Someone who can look at a case and understand not just the facts, but the way the facts were built and what's missing from them." She looked at him steadily. "Someone who spent a decade understanding how evidence works, how pressure works, how assumptions get built into cases, and how they get dismantled." The table between them was very small. Outside the window, Carver Street was going through its morning. A bus stopping, a woman with a stroller navigating around a mailbox, two men in construction vests waiting at the corner. Ordinary Tuesday morning, ordinary city, the world in its ordinary motion. I'm a building maintenance man, Mason said. I know what you are, Victoria said. I also know what you were. And I know that what you did the night of the gala wasn't about your past. It was just who you are when a problem presents itself. The answer to the problem that night was a relay switch and a camera feed. The answer to a lot of problems is something everyone overlooked because they were looking at the wrong things. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to run the program. I'm not asking for a full-time commitment. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult, case by case, your schedule, your terms. She paused. Emma's schedule too. Mason was quiet. The coffee machine cleared its throat again, and Marcello set a small plate of something, biscotti, the kind he made himself on Saturdays and put out on Tuesdays, because that was when they were the right degree of stale for dipping, on the edge of their table without comment. I'd need to see the actual case structure, Mason said finally. What intake looks like. What you'd be asking me to assess and what you'd do with the assessment. Victoria reached into her jacket and put a folded document on the table. 5 pages. Dense. She'd printed it, not sent it digitally, which meant she'd known she was going to need something physical to put in front of him. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up yet. You've been working on this for 10 days, he said. 9, she said. The first day I was too angry at myself to be useful. He looked at her across the small table, the gray jacket, the coffee held in both hands, the steadiness that was real and not performed. She was not an easy person to read, and she was not trying to be read, but he'd had enough time with her now to understand the basic architecture. She was direct to the point of bluntness when she trusted the other person to handle it. She did not perform warmth. She didn't feel, but she felt it when it was there. And she'd made a serious mistake 10 days ago and had spent every day since building something out of it. That wasn't nothing. It wasn't a foundation for unconditional trust either, but it was a start of a different kind of conversation. He picked up the document. He read it. Not quickly. He read it the way he read things that mattered, carefully, starting from the assumptions, looking for the places where the logic connected and the places where it was held together with hope rather than structure. Victoria drank her coffee and didn't say anything while he read, which he respected. There were problems with the document. 3 structural ones and 1 philosophical one that ran underneath everything else. A question about the relationship between the program and Vantage's legal obligations that she hadn't resolved yet, probably because she knew it was there and hadn't found the right answer. He set the document down and pointed to the 3rd page. This section, he said, the intake criteria. You've got financial threshold as the primary filter. Cases where the individual can't access legal resources above a certain dollar amount. But the people who need this most aren't always the ones below the income line. Sometimes it's the person who makes too much to qualify for public assistance and too little to actually fight what's happening to them. Victoria looked at the page. Middle income gap. It's where these things go unresolved most often. The very poor get public defenders and advocacy. The wealthy can buy their way out. The people in between fall through, she said. She was already reaching for a pen. The philosophical problem is on page 4, Mason said. The language around intervention. You've written it so that the program provides resources, but what it actually is, what it needs to be, is a check. On the people doing the accusing, not just the people being accused. If you don't build in a function that examines institutional behavior, you're just cleaning up after the fire instead of addressing the thing that starts them. Victoria looked at page 4. She looked at it for a long time. That's a harder sell to the board, she said. I know. They'll see it as the foundation going adversarial with employers. It is adversarial with employers, Mason said, when employers do the wrong thing. She looked up from the document. Something in her face had shifted. Not toward disagreement, toward the specific expression of someone who is thinking harder than they were a moment ago. You'd push back on me, she said. Not as a complaint, almost as a question. If the work required it. She nodded slowly. I think that's what I'm looking for, actually, she said. Someone who doesn't need the contract badly enough to tell me what I want to hear. The morning light was shifting on Carver Street. Marcello had moved to the far end of the counter and was doing something involving a small radio and what appeared to be a French press, entirely uninvested in the conversation happening at the corner table. "I'll look at the full structure," Mason said. "Not a commitment, an evaluation. I'll tell you what I think is workable and what isn't, and I'll tell you honestly if I think my involvement would actually help or just give the thing a credential it doesn't need." "That's fair," Victoria said. "One condition." She looked at him. "Emma's Spring Art Show is the third Saturday of April," Mason said. "Whatever the structure is, whatever cases come in, that Saturday is mine." Something changed in Victoria Sterling's face. Not dramatically, just a small shift, the kind that happens when a person realizes they're in a different conversation than they thought they were in, and it's a better one. "Third Saturday of April," she said. "Noted." He put the document in his jacket pocket. They finished their coffee. Outside, Carver Street kept being Carver Street. The bus, the mailbox, the construction vests, the ordinary Tuesday morning continuing without particular interest in the fact that two people at a corner table in a four-table coffee shop had just begun the slow, imperfect work of building something out of the wreckage of a very bad night. Neither of them said anything grand about it. There was nothing grand to say yet. There was just the document, and the problems with the document, and the possibility that the problems were fixable. Mason left first. He had a leaking pipe in 4B that had started doing something new overnight, and he wanted to look at it before the tenant left for work. Victoria stayed and ordered a second coffee. She asked Marcello what he'd recommend, and he said same thing, but hotter, and she said that was fine. Mason walked back along Carver Street in the early morning light, past the construction vests and the mailbox and the bus stop where two women were talking about something and laughing at intervals. He had Emma's lunch to make when he got home. He had a pipe to look at. He had a 5-page document in his jacket pocket with 3 structural problems and 1 philosophical one, and the beginning of a different kind of morning. He kept walking. The pipe in 4B turned out to be 2 problems pretending to be 1. That was how it usually went. Mason had been doing this work long enough to know that when something in a building started misbehaving, it was rarely the thing you could see that was the actual issue. The visible problem was just the thing that got loud enough to notice. The real problem was quieter and older and had been developing in the dark for longer than anyone wanted to think about. The tenant in 4B was a man named Gerald, mid-60s, retired, who spent his mornings doing a crossword at the kitchen table and his afternoons watching court television programs at a volume that suggested his hearing had been declining for some time, but that Gerald had not yet decided to acknowledge. He let Mason in without ceremony, pointed at the cabinet under the kitchen sink, and returned to his crossword. "Been dripping since yesterday," Gerald said without looking up. "Then last night it started doing something different, more of a gurgle." "A gurgle is usually the secondary line," Mason said, crouching to open the cabinet. "I don't know what that means." "Means it's been dripping for longer than yesterday." Gerald put his pencil down. "How much longer?" "Few weeks, probably. The corrosion on this fitting—" Mason touched the connector with 2 fingers. "That doesn't happen overnight." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was just condensation." "It was, at first. Then it wasn't." "Should I have said something sooner?" Mason looked at the fitting. The drip had been working at the particle board base of the cabinet long enough that the wood had begun to bow slightly, which meant water had found its way into the seam between the base and the back wall, which meant there was likely soft rot beginning in the wall cavity that he wouldn't know the extent of until he opened it. "Yes," Mason said, because Gerald was the kind of person who appreciated a straight answer. Gerald picked his pencil back up. "How bad?" "Not terrible. Not nothing. I'll need to open the wall." "How long?" "Today for the initial work. Depending on what I find, maybe a follow-up tomorrow." "I'll make coffee," Gerald said, which was his way of saying thank you. Mason worked for 2 hours. He cut into the wall cavity. The damage was moderate, a section of drywall about 18 inches across. The wood behind it stained but structurally recoverable, replaced the fitting, ran a new section of supply line, and packed the cavity with a moisture barrier before patching the drywall with the materials he kept in his cart. Not a perfect patch, not the kind you couldn't see at all, but solid, and he'd sand and repaint it on the follow-up visit when the compound had dried. Gerald brought coffee at the 90-minute mark and set it on the counter without interrupting, which Mason appreciated. They talked briefly while Mason let the compound set. Gerald had been a middle school science teacher for 30 years, a fact Mason had not known despite 14 months of living in the same building, and they had a conversation about water pressure and the physics of household plumbing that Gerald seemed to genuinely enjoy, asking questions not to fill silence but because he was actually curious. When Mason left, Gerald shook his hand at the door. "You do good work," he said, with the specific tone of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating whether students actually understood something or were just moving through the motions. "I mean that." "Thank you, Gerald." "The wall, too," Gerald said. "Most people patch it and leave it looking patched. You can barely tell." Mason went back downstairs, cleaned his tools, wrote up the work order, and thought about Gerald's water damage developing quietly in the dark for weeks, while something smaller and more visible got all the attention. He thought about Elliot Graves. He put the thought down. The deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the gala, in a downtown office building that housed the district attorney's office on 4 floors and had the specific atmospheric quality of a place where serious things happened routinely. Mason wore the same navy jacket he'd worn to the gala because it was the only jacket he owned, and because he'd decided, somewhere in the days following that night, that the jacket didn't owe him anything. It was a jacket. It had been in the wrong place at the right time, and that was the end of its significance. Reyes met him in the lobby. They shook hands and took the elevator to the 6th floor, and Reyes walked him through what the deposition would look like. "Straightforward," he said. "The footage was doing most of the work. The access logs were doing the rest." Mason's statement was corroboration rather than foundation. And Mason listened and nodded and thought Reyes was the kind of person who briefed you not because you needed it, but because he understood that knowing what was coming made the doing of it easier. The deposition itself took an hour and 40 minutes. 2 attorneys, a court reporter, a small room with a window that looked at the side wall of the building across the alley. Mason answered questions with the same flatness he'd used in the conference room at Vantage Tower. The sequence, the observations, the conclusions he'd drawn, and when, the things he'd known and the things he'd suspected, and the line between them. The attorneys were professional and thorough. One of them, a woman, younger than Mason expected, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned to work fast in a system that moved slowly, asked him to walk through the relay restoration twice, in detail, the second time with specific attention to the camera indicator light and what it had told him and when. He walked through it twice. At the end, the older attorney, heavy-set, 50-something, the kind of man who looked like he'd heard everything and found most of it predictable, asked Mason a question he hadn't been asked before. "Mr. Carter, in your estimation, and I want to be clear, this is off the formal record, this is just for my understanding of the case, when you walked into that conference room with Mr. Graves and the officers, before the footage was reviewed, did you believe you would be charged?" Mason considered the question. "I believed there was a real possibility." "And you were calm?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because being calm was the only thing I could do that would actually help." Mason paused. "Anger doesn't change footage. Panic doesn't change footage. What was on that camera was what was on it. All I could do was make sure the right people looked at it before the wrong conclusion became official." The attorney looked at him for a moment. "You were that confident in the footage." "I was that confident in what I'd seen in the corridor," Mason said. "The footage was just what I hoped would confirm it." The attorney nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating something. After, Reyes walked him back to the lobby, and they stood near the entrance for a few minutes while the building moved around them. People coming and going, a security guard at the desk who knew Reyes and gave him a chin-lift acknowledgement. "The arraignment is next week," Reyes said. "Graves is going to plead not guilty at first. That's standard. His new attorney, he hired one of the city's better white-collar defense people, is going to look for procedural angles, but the footage and the access logs are strong enough that there's not much to work with." He paused. "Axon Meridian has already begun distancing. 3 of their board members issued statements this morning. Corporate espionage cases move slow, but this one has enough visibility that the DA is motivated." What about the employee who helped with the sub-basement access? Cooperating. His statement placed Graves in the building during the preliminary event walkthrough 3 weeks before the gala. That was the access window. Graves used the facilities visit to get to the junction panel. Reyes shook his head slightly. He was thorough. If you hadn't been standing next to that box and known what to do with it, someone else might have found it, Mason said. Maybe, Reyes said, in a tone that suggested he didn't think so. They shook hands. Mason walked out into the Tuesday morning. It was cold in the way of late February. Not brutal, but insistent. The kind of cold that reminded you that winter was still making a point, and walked 4 blocks to his car thinking about the deposited statement, about Graves's attorney looking for procedural angles, about the slow grinding of institutional justice and the gap between what happened and when the record caught up to it. He thought about the cases in Victoria's document, the people who'd been waiting for the record to catch up and run out of time or resources before it did. He'd spent the 2 weeks since Marcello's with the document on the kitchen table, working through it in the evenings after Emma was in bed, making notes in the margins and the mechanical pencil he kept in his tool belt, cross-referencing the structural problems against the draft framework Victoria had circulated in a follow-up email with the subject line simply second draft. See page 3. She'd addressed 2 of the 3 structural problems. The third one, the middle income gap, she'd attempted and gotten partway there. The philosophical problem on page 4 had been reworked twice and was closer, but not right yet. He'd called her about page 4. Not emailed, called, because some things don't work in writing when they're still being worked out. She'd answered on the second ring at 9:15 on a Thursday night, which told him she was still working. Page 4, she said, before he said what he was calling about. Page 4, he confirmed. I know, she said. Tell me what's wrong with the new version. You've written the program as reactive, he said. Cases come in, you assess them, you intervene. But the people who are most vulnerable in these situations are the ones who don't know they have a case. They think what's happening to them is how it's supposed to work. They don't know to reach out. A silence on her end. He heard the sound of something, her setting down a glass maybe, or closing a laptop. Outreach, she said. Partnerships with the communities most likely to have these situations and least likely to know there's recourse. Not advertising. Actual relationships with people who work on the ground level in those places. That changes the scope significantly. Yes? It also changes the cost structure. Yes. Another silence. He could feel her doing the arithmetic, not just the financial kind, the political kind, what the board would say, what it meant for the existing structure, what she'd have to give up in other areas to make it work. If I can make that case to the board, she said, what would the community outreach actually look like in practice? I don't know yet, Mason said. I'd need to talk to some people. What people? He thought about Patrice at the community center on Delancey Street. The reading glasses always pushed up on her head. The $37 a month she'd negotiated without being asked to. People who've been doing this work for a long time without a foundation's backing, he said. The ones who know what actually gets used and what just looks good in an annual report. Will they talk to you? Probably, Mason said, if I'm honest about what this is. And what is it? She asked. Not as a challenge, as a real question. An attempt, he said, by people who should have been doing this longer and are starting now. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, That's honest. It's what it is. Okay, Victoria said. Talk to your people. Bring me what they say. I'll handle the board. He talked to Patrice the following Monday, catching her between the end of the after-school programs and the start of her evening administrative work, sitting in 2 folding chairs in the community center's back office with the reading glasses on the filing cabinet between them because she'd taken them off her head to think and forgotten to put them back. Patrice had listened to Mason describe the program concept without interrupting, which was not her natural inclination. She was a person who asked questions as they occurred to her, but she'd held them, and he could see her cataloging them for the end. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. How much money are we talking? She said. Significant initial endowment. She's committed the board to a serious funding level. Who controls the intake decisions? Still being structured. That's part of what I'm asking. Patrice looked at the reading glasses on the cabinet. Because if a corporation controls intake, they control which cases are visible and which ones aren't, and the cases that go away quietly are always the ones involving corporate actors. I know, Mason said. That's the problem I'm trying to solve before the structure is set. You're asking me what would make this trustworthy to the people it's supposed to serve. Yes. Patrice picked up the reading glasses and turned them over in her hands. She did this when she was working through something, Mason had noticed. The glasses were a thinking prop. Independent Intake Committee, she said, not employed by Vantage or any Vantage affiliate. Community advocates, an employment attorney, someone from a civil rights org. They review. They decide what's a case and what isn't. The foundation funds but doesn't filter. Victoria's going to push back on losing control of intake. Then it's not a real program, Patrice said simply. It's a PR function with extra steps. Mason nodded. And the outreach, Patrice said. You can't do outreach to these communities by putting up posters or running ads. The people who need this most have been burned enough times by organizations that showed up with money and a logo that they're not going to respond to that. You need to go through the people they already trust, which means building those relationships before there are cases to refer, which means showing up before you need anything. She looked at him. That takes time, real time, not a press release and a launch event. I know. Does your billionaire CEO know? I'm going to tell her. Patrice looked at him for a long moment, not skeptically exactly, but with the particular assessment of someone who had seen many well-funded initiatives arrive in communities like this one and leave without having done what they said they would do. Why are you involved in this, Mason? She asked. Really? He looked at the folding chair, the concrete block wall, the reading glasses in her hands. He thought about the conference room at Vantage Tower, the evidence bag with the prototype in it, Graves's practice smoothness. He thought about Emma in the folding chair near the exhibition wall, folding and unfolding the corner of her program, watching the glass partition. Because I know what it costs to be the wrong person in the wrong room, he said, and I know I got out of it because of a camera that happened to come back online. Most people don't have a camera. Patrice was quiet. Most people, Mason said, are still sitting in that conference room. She put the reading glasses back on her head. Get me a meeting with Victoria Sterling, she said. Not a formal one. Coffee somewhere. And she comes to me, I'm not going to her building. I'll arrange it. And Mason. She looked at him. If this turns into a logo and a press event in 6 months, I'm going to tell people exactly what it was. You understand that? I'm counting on it, he said. He'd relayed the conversation to Victoria in an email that was longer than his usual emails because some things needed the detail. Her response came at 11:40 that night, which was when she apparently processed email. It said, Independent Intake Committee. Agreed in principle. I'll fight for it with the board. Patrice's terms for outreach are correct. Can you arrange coffee? Her location, her schedule. He'd arranged it. They'd met the following Friday. Victoria arriving at the community center on Delancey Street in a car that she'd parked a block away because she'd had the sense to understand that pulling up to a community center in whatever she drove would not be the right opening. She came in wearing the same gray jacket from Marcello's and shook Patrice's hand and sat in one of the folding chairs and listened for 45 minutes with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely learning something and knew it. Patrice asked hard questions. Victoria answered them without deflecting. Where she didn't know the answer, she said so. Where the answer was incomplete, she said that too. At the end, Patrice had looked at Mason, not at Victoria, at Mason, and given him a single small nod. The kind of nod that meant I haven't decided yet, but I haven't walked away either, which from Patrice was a significant position. Walking back to the car afterward, Victoria had said quietly, She terrifies me a little. Good, Mason said. That's not a comforting response. She should. She's been doing this work for 20 years with no resources and no support, and she's still here. You should find that terrifying. Victoria was quiet for half a block. I do, she said finally. I find it genuinely humbling, which is not a word I use without meaning it. He'd believed her. That was the thing he kept coming back to in the days after. The thing he was working out in the quiet of the apartment in the evenings while Emma did homework at the kitchen table and the city went about its business outside. Victoria Sterling was not a simple person to read, and she was not trying to be. She was impatient and direct, and she had resources that distorted her relationship to what things cost. And she had made a serious error of judgment on the night of the gala that she was aware of and carrying in a way that wasn't performance. She was also, he was finding, the kind of person who took in information that changed her position and actually changed her position. Not publicly, with announcement, just quietly, internally, and then the next conversation started from a different place. That was rarer than it should have been. On a Thursday evening in the third week of February, Mason was under the kitchen sink in his own apartment fixing a slow drain, a buildup of the particular variety that accumulates when a 9-year-old washes paint from her hands and brushes with the specific disregard for sink health that characterizes a person whose primary concern is the painting, when Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Someone's on TV about the thing," she said. He came out from under the sink. "What thing?" "The gala thing. The arrest." He hadn't been following the coverage. He'd made a deliberate decision not to. Not out of avoidance exactly, but because watching coverage of something you'd been in the middle of was a particular kind of disorienting, the way it flattened and reordered and selected from the actual experience and made it into a different shape that was designed for someone who hadn't been there. Emma led him to the living room, where the television, a 14-year-old model that had come with the apartment and that Mason had repaired once by replacing a capacitor on the control board, a fix that had bought it another 3 years at minimum, was showing a news program. The chyron read, "Vantage Global Legal Advisor Arraigned in Corporate Espionage Case." On screen, footage of Graves being walked into a courthouse. His new attorney beside him, both of them doing the move where you don't look at cameras by looking at a very specific point in the middle distance. The anchor was saying something about the biometric security sector and the competitive dynamics between Vantage Global and Axon Meridian. Then, a clip of a spokesperson for the DA's office noting the strength of the digital evidence. Then, footage of the exterior of Vantage Tower. Then a photograph of Mason. He hadn't known there would be a photograph. He hadn't been told. It was from the guest manifest, the check-in photo taken at the entrance, the one where you look into a small camera and don't quite smile. He looked tired in it. He looked actually like a man who'd been up since 6 and had come to a formal event in a jacket that was slightly short in the sleeve. The anchor was describing him as a building maintenance worker and former federal employee who helped expose the scheme by restoring a secondary security camera. Brief, not inaccurate, missing approximately everything that made it true. Emma looked at the television, then at Mason. "You look tired in that photo," she said. "I was tired in that photo. It was a long day." It was. "They got your job right," she said. "Building maintenance." "Yes." She watched the screen for another moment. The segment was moving on. Something about the implications for corporate security practices. A talking head from a business school. Emma's interest was already going elsewhere, back to whatever she'd been doing before. The news segment filed in the relevant category and cross-referenced appropriately. "Dad," she said, on her way back to the kitchen. "Yeah. The photo makes you look like you need to sleep more." "I do need to sleep more." "I know," she said, and disappeared through the doorway. He stood in front of the television for another moment after she was gone, watching the segment conclude with the Vantage Global logo on screen and the anchor moving to the next story. He thought about the photograph, the way the camera had caught him in a moment that was true but incomplete, the way photographs always were. A slice of the actual thing, missing the before and after that made it mean what it meant. He turned the television off. He went back to the kitchen sink. Emma was at the table with her homework, which appeared to be math. She had her pencil moving in the determined way of someone who had decided a problem was going to yield to pressure. He got back under the sink and worked the drain clean, the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been slow and was now clear, and thought about nothing in particular except the work in front of him. "Dad," Emma said. Her voice had a different quality, not the casual register of someone continuing a conversation, something more deliberate. He came out from under the sink again. She was looking at her math homework, but her pencil had stopped. She was looking at the page, but seeing something else. "What if they hadn't found the camera?" she said. Not as a question, really. more as a thing she'd been holding and had decided to put down. He sat back on his heels, looked at her. "Then we'd have fought it a different way," he said. "But it would have been harder." "Yes. A lot harder." "Yes, Emma." She was quiet for a moment. The pencil turned over in her fingers, eraser end, tip end. "It was lucky," she said. "Some of it," he agreed. "The camera coming back online. That part was lucky. Or lucky adjacent. I didn't know it would matter when I fixed it." "But you fixed it anyway." "It needed fixing." She looked at him then. The full attention of those serious, thinking eyes, the eyes that were her mother's eyes, though he never said that out loud, just carried it privately in the way you carry things that are both beautiful and painful. "What if you hadn't been able to fix it?" she asked. "The relay. What if you hadn't known how?" "Then someone else would have found another way. Or it would have taken longer, or—" He stopped. "I don't know, Em. I can only tell you what did happen, not what would have happened if something was different." She considered this. "That's true," she said. "You can only know what you actually did." "Yes." She turned the pencil back to the writing end and looked at her math problem. "Okay," she said, which was Emma's way of closing a subject she'd finished with for now. Not forever, just for now. He watched her work for a moment. The bent head, the focused set of her shoulders, the braids that needed redoing. This weekend, he needed to remember. The kitchen table covered in her books and her notebook, and the chewed-on pencil, and the small spiral things she kept for things she wanted to remember, all of it making the table completely unusable as a dining surface, which it hadn't been used as in 2 years. He went back under the sink. Above him, Emma's pencil scratched at the problem. The building hummed with its ordinary night sounds. Somewhere on the street below, a car horn, brief and without apparent purpose. He was finishing the drain work, wrench in hand, when his phone buzzed on the counter. He came out, dried his hands, checked it. A text from Victoria. No preamble, which was her style. Board meeting Thursday. Independent Intake Committee approved. Patrice has been contacted. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "We'll see. I'm taking that as progress." He looked at the message for a moment. He typed back, "It is." For Patrice, that's basically a standing ovation. 3 minutes later. "Good to know. Also, I'm told the DA's office mentioned you in their press briefing today. Did you see?" He typed, "Saw the segment. They called me a building maintenance worker." A pause. Then, "You are a building maintenance worker." He looked at the text. Then he typed, "Yes, I am." Her response came fast. "I meant that without any condescension. For the record." He thought about how to answer that. About the navy jacket, slightly short in the sleeve. About Gerald's water damage developing in the dark. About the relay switch and the camera indicator light and the 4 minutes at the junction box. About Emma asleep in the back seat on the drive home. His watch on her wrist. He typed, "I know. Good night, Victoria." Her response, "Good night." He put the phone down and finished the drain, and when he was done, he washed his hands at the newly cleared sink, the water running freely, and called to Emma that he was going to start dinner, and Emma said she was almost done with the math problem, and he started dinner. The apartment smelled like whatever was cooking and sounded like Emma's pencil, and the building's ordinary hum and felt, the way it felt on good evenings, like the specific weight of a life that was tight in some places and worn in others, and exactly, precisely his. The third Saturday of April arrived the way Saturdays do when you've been watching them approach for weeks. Suddenly, all at once, as if the calendar had been holding its breath and finally let go. Mason was up at 6:15, which was not unusual. He was usually up before Emma, had been since she was an infant, and the habit had simply never reversed itself. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window with the mug held in both hands the way Victoria held hers at Marcello's, and watched the early light work its way across the roofline of the building across the street. The sky was doing something tentative, not quite overcast, not quite clear, the kind of April sky that hadn't committed yet. Emma appeared at 6:48, which was early for her on a Saturday. She was already dressed. Dark pants, a white shirt with small blue dots that she'd ironed herself the night before, with the iron she'd asked Mason to show her how to use 3 months ago. after which she'd informed him that she preferred to do her own ironing because he consistently left a crease in the wrong place. She was carrying her good shoes in one hand, which meant she planned to put them on at the last possible moment to preserve their condition for the event itself. "You're up," Mason said. "I've been up," she said. "I was reading." "Since when?" 5:30. "Emma." "I couldn't sleep." She set the shoes by the door with the precision of someone placing them exactly where they would be when needed. "Is the coffee ready?" "You don't drink coffee." "I know. I meant for you. Is there enough?" He looked at his mug. "There's enough." She sat at the kitchen table, cleared of its usual layer of books and notebooks because she'd cleaned it the night before, which she did before events that mattered to her, establishing order in the controllable things when the uncontrollable things were producing anticipation she didn't want to name out loud. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. "What if nobody comes?" she said, not dramatically, just as a thing she'd been sitting with since 5:30. "People will come," Mason said. "You have to say that." "I have to say a lot of things. This one happens to be true." He brought his coffee to the table and sat across from her. "Patrice has been posting about it at the center for 3 weeks. Ms. Aldridge said she was coming. The program has 12 kids in it," Emma said. 12 families. That's not a lot of people." "It's a lot of people who matter," Mason said. Emma looked at her hands on the table. "Marcus is showing 3 pieces," she said. "Marcus, of the very good trees. He's been working on them since January." "I know, you told me. His trees are really good. You've told me that too." She looked up at him. "I'm showing 2 pieces," she said. "Is that enough?" "What are the 2 pieces?" "Shelter. And the new one." The new one had been made in February, during the weeks after the gala, during the Tuesday and Thursday sessions at the center, when Emma had been processing something she hadn't talked about directly, but that had clearly been working in her. Mason had seen it for the first time 2 weeks ago, when she'd brought it home to show him before it went up for the spring show. It was different from Shelter, where Shelter was restraint, the fine lines, the controlled palette, the single defined gesture. The new one was more complicated. It showed a room, seen from above, which was a perspective Mason hadn't expected from her. A room full of people, rendered in rough shapes rather than detailed figures, and in the center of the room, slightly separate from the others, 2 figures, a larger one and a smaller one. The larger one had its hand on the smaller one's shoulder, or that's what it looked like. The gesture was ambiguous enough that it could have been something else. The room around them was rendered in blues and grays. The 2 figures in the center were the only things in the painting that had any warmth in their color. He had looked at the painting for a long time without saying anything. "It's called Found," Emma had said, standing beside him. He hadn't asked her to explain it. He hadn't asked her to explain Shelter either. He was beginning to understand that Emma's paintings operated in a register that didn't need his questions to be complete. "It's 2 pieces," he said now, at the kitchen table, "and they're both good. That's enough, Em." She looked at him for a moment with the assessment she'd inherited from somewhere. Not him, he didn't think, or maybe partly him, the part that was always doing the quiet arithmetic of a room. "Okay," she said, and then, "Can we leave a little early?" "How early?" 45 minutes before it starts. "That's very early. I want to see how they've hung everything before anyone gets there." He thought about the gala. Shelter on the wall, tilted 1.5 degrees to the left. 2 fingers on the lower corner of the frame, the smallest correction that mattered enormously. "Yeah," he said, "we can leave early." The spring show was held in the community center's main room, a large multi-purpose space that on any given weekday housed after-school programs, a seniors' lunch, 2 different evening English classes, and a weekly meeting of a neighborhood association that was currently engaged in a years-long battle about a proposed zoning change that Patrice held opinions on. Today it had been cleared and arranged by Patrice and 2 volunteers into something that was not a gallery exactly, but was trying to be one, and almost made it. White paper had been taped to the walls in sections, giving the concrete block a cleaner backdrop. The paintings were hung at varying heights, adjusted to the artist's eye levels, something Mason noticed again and again as they walked in. The lighting was the overhead fluorescents, which were not ideal for artwork, and which Patrice had partially addressed by hanging 2 extra lamps from the ceiling on extension cords, their warm bulbs throwing a better light over the main exhibition space. It wasn't perfect. It was someone doing the best they could with what they had, which was its own kind of thing. Emma walked the room before anyone else arrived. She moved slowly, stopping at each piece, looking at it the way she looked at things she was taking seriously, not just with her eyes, but with her whole attention, the way a person listens when they're actually listening. She had opinions, which she kept to herself today, which was a form of consideration. Mason followed at enough distance to give her the experience of the room without his presence crowding it. Shelter was hung near the entrance, not the place of highest visibility in the room, but close to it. The new archival frame Victoria had arranged had arrived 2 weeks ago. Dark wood, clean lines, and Emma had looked at it for a long time when Mason had shown her and then said, very quietly, "It looks serious," which was the highest compliment in her vocabulary for things that weren't people. Found was hung at the far end of the main wall. Emma stood in front of it for a moment. Someone, Patrice probably, had placed it at almost exactly Emma's eye level. She tilted her head slightly, the small adjustment of someone reading something. "It's straight," Mason said from behind her. "I know," Emma said. "I was just checking." He smiled at the back of her head. People started arriving at 11. Families mostly. The 12 families of the 12 artists, plus the ones they'd brought. Ms. Aldridge, Emma's teacher, came with her partner and stood in front of Marcus's trees for a long time. Patrice moved through the room in her efficient, everywhere way, the reading glasses up on her head, pausing to speak with parents and then redirecting toward whatever needed redirecting. There was food on a table near the far wall, the kind of food that shows up at community events because various families have contributed various things, a specific American culinary democracy of store-bought cookies next to homemade something next to a fruit tray next to a casserole dish that someone had brought because they weren't sure what else to bring. Marcus, who was 11 and whose trees were genuinely remarkable, found Emma early in the event, and they stood together in front of one of his pieces arguing about whether the foreground tree needed more shadow, which was a conversation between two people who cared about something enough to disagree about it, which was its own good sign. Victoria arrived at 11:30. Mason saw her come in, which meant most of the room didn't notice because she'd come in the side door rather than the main entrance, and she wasn't wearing anything that announced her. The same gray jacket, dark jeans. She'd also, he noticed this, left whatever she normally drove at a distance and walked, because she came in from the side door with the particular slightly windswept quality of someone who'd walked a few blocks in April weather. She stood near the entrance for a moment, getting the room. She was good at getting rooms. He'd noticed that about her, the quick calibration, the reading of where things were. Then she saw him and came over. "The side door," he said. "Didn't want to make an entrance," she said. "You could have just used the front door like everyone else." The front door felt more visible. She looked around the room. It's good. They did a good job in here." "Patrice did a good job." "Yes." Victoria scanned the room until she found Patrice, currently in conversation with a family near the cookie table. "I know. I'm going to tell her. She'll accept the compliment and then tell you something you need to hear," Mason said. "I'm prepared for that." She looked at the walls. "Which is the new one?" He pointed. Victoria walked toward the far end of the main wall, and Mason watched her stand in front of Found and watched the particular quality of attention that came into her posture when she was looking at something that was doing something to her. She stood there for almost a full minute. Then she turned and found Mason across the room and said nothing, just looked at him, and something in the look was complicated enough that he gave her a small nod, and she turned back to the painting. Emma appeared from the direction of Marcus's trees and stopped when she saw Victoria. "You came," Emma said. Not accusatory, not surprised exactly, more like someone checking a hypothesis. "I said I would," Victoria said. Emma looked at her with the full assessment. "You said the painting deserved better than fine," she said, about the frame. "I remember." Emma looked at the painting on the wall, the new frame, Found at the center of it. "It does look more serious," Emma said. "It was always serious," Victoria said. "The frame just lets other people see it faster." Emma considered this. "That's true," she said, as if Victoria had solved a small puzzle. Then she went back toward Marcus and his trees because she had opinions about the foreground shadow, and she wasn't done with them yet. Victoria looked at Mason. "She's something," Victoria said. "I know," Mason said. "Does she always do that? Talk to adults like she's the one running the assessment?" "Always." Victoria smiled. It was a real one. Not the professional warmth she deployed in rooms full of investors, but the slightly unguarded kind that appeared when something had surprised her. He'd seen it a few times now. He was getting better at recognizing it. "The board approved the intake committee structure on Thursday," she said, shifting registers the way she did when she'd had enough of the personal and was ready for the work. 4 members: employment attorney, civil rights advocate, a community representative, and a social worker. None of them employed by Vantage. Independent review, majority decision required before any case engagement. Patrice is the community representative. If she'll do it, I'm asking her today. "She'll want it in writing," Mason said. "Full independence clause. No Vantage override on case decisions." "Already in the draft agreement." Victoria paused. "She's going to find something wrong with the draft anyway." "Yes," Mason said, "and she'll be right." Victoria nodded, accepting this. "We're calling it the Clearance Initiative," she said, "the foundation program." "Why clearance?" "Because the goal is clearing people who shouldn't have been charged in the first place, clearing the record, clearing the assumption." She paused. "And because it's plain language, not Institute for Workforce Justice or something that sounds like a building." "Emma would approve of plain language," Mason said. "I thought she might." Victoria looked out at the room, the families, the paintings, Patrice talking to someone with the reading glasses vibrating with authority on her head. "The announcement is next week. The formal launch event isn't going to be a gala. It's going to be here." Mason looked at her. "Here. At the community center, Patrice's home court. I'm not announcing it from a ballroom." She said it flatly, as a decided thing. "I'm done with ballrooms for a while." He didn't say anything. He thought about the Vantage Tower grand ballroom and the $5,000 plates, and the chandeliers and the darkness that had come down when the power failed, and everything that had followed from that darkness. "One more thing," Victoria said. She reached into her jacket, the gray jacket, the one that had started to feel like a consistent choice rather than a coincidence, and produced a folded document. Thin, a few pages, the kind of thing you print when you want someone to be able to hold it. "What is this, Mason said. "The formal consulting structure. Everything we've discussed. Scope, rate, schedule protections." She paused. "The 3rd Saturday of April is protected in perpetuity, by the way. I had legal put it in the document." He looked at the document. He didn't take it yet. "In perpetuity is a long contract term." "I know," she said. "I put it in anyway." He took the document. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket, the navy jacket, slightly short in the sleeve, and he thought that he would read it tonight at the kitchen table, in the particular quiet of after Emma's bedtime, with the mechanical pencil from his tool belt, and he would find 2 or 3 things wrong with it, and he would call Victoria about them, and she would have already anticipated at least one of them. That was how it would go. That was the shape of what they'd built, imperfectly and in pieces, out of one very bad night and 10 days of reckoning and the slow accumulation of small, honest conversations. "I'll read it tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "You'll call me about page 2. Probably page 3. It's always the page you don't expect." She looked around the room one more time. "I should find Patrice." "Side door," Mason said. "She's been watching you since you came in." Victoria looked. Patrice was indeed watching her from across the room, the reading glasses on her head, the expression of a woman who has not yet decided but is still here, which was the expression Mason had come to understand as Patrice's version of an open door. "How do I approach her?" Victoria asked. "Walk over there," Mason said. "Don't prepare anything, just walk over." "That's it?" "That's it. She can tell when people have prepared. It bothers her." But Victoria straightened slightly, not the defensive kind of straightening, just the kind that comes before you do something that matters, and walked across the room toward Patrice. Mason watched them for a moment. Patrice with her arms slightly crossed, Not hostile, but not welcoming. The reading glasses up, and Victoria stopping at the right distance and saying something he couldn't hear, and Patrice's arms uncrossing after a few seconds, and the two of them beginning to talk. He didn't need to hear it. He trusted the work that had already been done. He found a spot along the side wall near a painting by a kid named Josie, who had made something remarkable with charcoal and blue paint that he'd been looking at since they arrived. He stood there with his coffee. Patrice had made coffee, the industrial kind that community centers made, strong enough to be real, and watched the room. It was not a glamorous room. It was not the Vantage Tower grand ballroom with its chandeliers and its centerpieces and its carefully maintained idea of what an event was supposed to look like. The overhead fluorescents buzzed slightly. The extra lamps on extension cords were doing their best. The food table had a paper tablecloth that was already creasing in one corner from someone leaning against it. And in this room that was trying hard and almost making it, 12 kids had put their real work on the wall. Work that had cost them something. Tuesday afternoons and Thursday afternoons, and the particular effort of making something that didn't exist before, and then letting other people look at it, which was its own kind of courage that people who hadn't done it tended to underestimate. Emma was across the room now, standing with Marcus and a third kid whose name Mason didn't know, the three of them having some kind of three-way disagreement that appeared to involve gesturing at different parts of the wall. Emma's hands were moving. She talked with her hands when she was engaged, a habit she'd had since she was small, and that Mason had never tried to correct because it seemed to be part of how she thought. Her braids were slightly loose at the ends. The white shirt with the blue dots was still neat, which was remarkable given the hour. She was, he thought, doing exactly what she should be doing, arguing about art with other people who cared about it, in a room where the work mattered more than the venue, on a Saturday morning in April, with the sky outside finally deciding to be clear. The thought moved through him without announcement and settled somewhere without a name. He knew what it was. He'd known it for years, in the wordless way you know things that are too fundamental to require language. But sometimes it surfaced with a clarity that felt almost physical, the specific weight of a fact that was larger than you had room for, pressing from the inside. She was going to be okay. More than okay, She was already more than okay, in ways that had nothing to do with the gala or Victoria's foundation or any of the things that had happened in the past 6 weeks. She'd been okay before any of that. She'd been sitting in the chair near the exhibition wall, folding the corner of her program, waiting with a patience that was not passivity, but its own kind of strength. And she'd been okay then, too. He'd done some of that. He knew that. He'd been there, and being there was not a small thing, even when it looked like nothing from the outside. Even when it looked like parking on a side street 4 blocks from the venue because the garage was $30, or ironing a dress at 11:15 while she was asleep, or sitting on an overturned bucket in a basement utility room to get better signal. He'd done those things imperfectly, and sometimes with the low-grade anxiety of a person who was always doing the math on the margin, checking whether the numbers worked, trying to get from one end of the month to the other without anything critical breaking. He'd done them tired, and sometimes frustrated, and occasionally with the private, unannounced grief of a man who was doing the work of 2 people and missing the other one without being able to say so to the person who missed her most. He'd done them anyway, every Tuesday and every Thursday, for $37 a month. And Emma, in the room across from him, arguing about shadow and foreground and the particular blue of Marcus's water, was the evidence that it had been enough. Not perfect, not the life he'd planned, not remotely, but enough. Something more than enough. He finished his coffee. Patrice appeared beside him. She'd broken away from Victoria, who was now on her phone near the back wall, likely handling something that couldn't wait even on a Saturday, which was simply who Victoria was and probably wasn't going to change. Patrice stood next to Mason and looked at the room. "She asked me to be on the intake committee," Patrice said. "I know. I told her I'd think about it." "I know." Patrice was quiet for a moment. "The draft agreement has an independence clause. I told her you'd need it." "It's well drafted," Patrice said, with the reluctance of someone being fair about something they'd been prepared to be critical of. "Better than I expected." "She's a good lawyer," Mason said. "She just doesn't always remember that being a good lawyer isn't the whole job." "Are you helping her remember?" "When she needs it." Patrice nodded slowly. She watched the room for another moment, the families, the kids, the paintings on the white paper against the concrete block. "The program is good work," she said. "Patrice, I mean." She caught herself. "I mean the community center program, not me." "I know what you meant." "I'm going to say yes to the committee," she said. "I just want her to wait a week while I think about it." "Why?" "Because if she gets yes too easily, she'll think it was too easy," Patrice said, with the particular pragmatism of someone who had been negotiating with well-resourced institutions for 20 years. "And if she thinks it was easy, she won't value it right." Mason looked at her. "That's a little calculated," he said. "Yes," Patrice agreed, "it is." She didn't seem bothered by this. "I have been doing this work for 20 years, and I have watched 8 different foundations launch programs to serve communities like this one, and I have watched 6 of those 8 lose interest within 3 years. The ones that didn't lose interest were the ones where the institution had to work for the relationship. So yes, I'm going to make her wait a week." She pushed the reading glasses up on her head, a gesture of finality. "And I'm going to tell you that you should make sure she knows this isn't going to be easy, because if it's easy, it's not real." "She knows," Mason said. "Make sure." "I will." Patrice gave him the nod, the small one, the one that meant "we're done here, we understand each other," and moved back into the room, already redirecting towards something that needed her attention near the food table where the paper tablecloth had developed a more serious crease situation. Mason looked across the room at Victoria, who had finished her phone call and was now standing in front of Found again, looking at it with her arms folded. Not closed off. That was just how she stood when she was thinking. He'd learned to read the difference. He walked over. She heard him coming and didn't look away from the painting. "It's the perspective," she said when he was beside her. "The overhead angle. Most people would paint it from the inside of the room. She painted it from above. Like someone watching. Like someone trying to understand what the room was," Mason said. "Yes." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "How old was she when you left federal work?" 4. "She doesn't remember it." "No." "But she painted this," Victoria said, indicating Found, the room seen from above, the 2 figures at the center with the only warmth in the image. "She paints what she knows," Mason said. "She knows me. She knows what it's cost and what it's been worth, and she knows them at the same time, which is something I couldn't do at her age." He paused. "She's better at some things than I am." Victoria absorbed this. She didn't fill the space around it, which he appreciated. She let it sit. "The consulting structure," she said after a moment. "I want to be honest about something." "Okay?" "When I first thought about bringing you in, part of my reasoning was, I won't say guilt, because guilt isn't useful, but something adjacent to it. I thought, I owe this person something, and this is the way to provide it." She looked at him. "That was the wrong reason." "I know," Mason said. "You knew that." "I suspected it. Page 1 of the document, the framing paragraph. The language is too apologetic for a professional structure. It reads like a compensation." She looked faintly pained. "Page 1. I was going to tell you." "I know you were." She looked back at the painting. "The right reason is that you see things I don't. You see the room from above, whatever she got that from." Victoria gestured at Found. "You have a version of it, and the program needs it more than it needs me to feel better about the gala." "That's the right reason," Mason said. "I rewrote the framing paragraph," she said, "after I printed the version in your pocket. Don't read the one in your pocket." "What's wrong with it?" "It's too apologetic," she said dryly. "Apparently." He laughed. Not long, not big, just real. The kind that comes out because it can't help it, the same way it had come out in the ballroom when Emma had said both of you about the wrinkled jacket and the hard night. Victoria looked at him when he laughed, and something in her expression did the thing it did sometimes. The small unguarding, the moment where the performance of steadiness relaxed into actual steadiness, which was quieter and more honest. "I'm going to tell you something," Mason said. "Okay." 6 weeks ago, I was sitting in a conference room being built into a frame I didn't fit, and the thing that kept me calm was knowing what I'd actually done and trusting that the record would catch up eventually. He looked at the painting. But the record almost didn't. It was 4 minutes and a dead indicator light, and a relay that I knew how to reset because I've been fixing things in buildings that nobody notices for 5 years. He paused. Most people don't have the indicator light. Most people don't know how to read it, even if they do. That's what the program is for, Victoria said. That's what the program has to actually be for, Mason said. Not what it says it's for, what it does in practice, in rooms where there's no camera and no one knows to look. Victoria looked at him for a moment. You're going to push me on this for a long time, she said. Yes. Every time I drift toward the version that sounds better than it is. Yes. She absorbed this. Okay, she said, and then more quietly. Good. Across the room, Emma had broken away from Marcus and the third kid and was standing in front of shelter near the entrance, looking at it the way you look at something you made a long time ago and are taking the measure of. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, which was how she stood when she was being patient. The archival frame made the painting look, as she had said, serious. The rain lines caught the lamplight, the man under the rain. The umbrella held not over himself but over the small figure beside him, who was dry. Patrice stopped beside Emma and said something Mason couldn't hear. Emma looked up at her. Patrice put a hand briefly on Emma's shoulder. The most physical affection Patrice dispensed, in Mason's experience, and only to people she had decided mattered, and then moved on. Emma looked back at the painting. From across the room she turned her head and found Mason, with the ease of a person who always knew roughly where he was in a room. She looked at him for a moment, then at Victoria beside him, then back at him. She raised 2 fingers. He raised 2 fingers back. The old gesture. Since the conference room, since the glass partition, since the night where the worst thing and the best thing had happened in the same few hours. It had become something between them that didn't need explanation. It probably never had needed one. She turned back to her painting. The room continued around them. The families, the food table, the fluorescent buzz, Patrice in perpetual motion, Marcus explaining something about his trees to a man who appeared to be his grandfather, Ms. Aldridge standing in front of a piece by a kid Mason didn't know and pressing her hand to her sternum the way people do when something lands. Mason thought about the gala, about the darkness when the power failed, about the 43 steps to the conference room and what it felt like to walk them with his chin level and his hands loose, about Graves across the table and the way the man's hand had gone still when the footage played, about Reyes's handshake that lasted a half-second longer than necessary, and the things that were carried in that half-second. He thought about Emma in the car on the way home, his watch on her wrist, out before they crossed the bridge. He thought about the green dress and the white tights and the braids that needed redoing and the 3 appetizers she ate with the efficiency of a child who hadn't admitted she was hungry until things were settled. He thought about things that leave marks you can't see, and the marks themselves being different from damage. Different in nature, different in what they required. The visible kind of mark got addressed, the invisible kind you carried, and the carrying was its own education in what mattered and what didn't. He had a 5-page document in his jacket pocket with a framing paragraph that needed to be rewritten and 3 structural problems he'd identified, and 1 philosophical problem he was still working on, and a protected date in perpetuity for the 3rd Saturday of April. He had a 9-year-old daughter across the room who was standing in front of her own work with her hands clasped behind her back, taking the measure of what she'd made and what it meant. He had a pipe in 4B that needed a follow-up visit on Monday, and a baseboard in his own apartment that needed painting, and an elevator door on the 6th floor that had started catching on its track again in a new place, which meant the issue wasn't the door but the track, and he'd need to look at the alignment. These things were all equally true, and equally his, and he held them all without ranking them, because the ranking was where people went wrong, the idea that some of what you did was the real life, and some was just the time between. He'd understood for a while now that it was all the real life, every last piece of it. Victoria said quietly beside him, "You're thinking about something." "Several things," Mason said. "Anything I need to know for the program?" "Not yet." She nodded. She was learning, he thought, the difference between the things that would eventually become relevant and the things that were simply his. She was better at that than she'd been 6 weeks ago. He was better at some things, too. Nobody in this room was better than Emma at the painting, though. That was simply the fact of it. She was 9 years old, and she had looked at the world from above and painted what she saw and put it on the wall and let other people look, and the people who looked were stopped by what they found. That was, in Mason's private accounting, the most remarkable thing that had happened since the night the lights went out in the Vantage Tower Grand Ballroom. Not the footage that cleared him, not Graves in handcuffs, not the document in his pocket, or the foundation program, or Victoria Sterling standing in a room where she clearly hadn't stood before. The painting on the wall, the 9-year-old who'd made it, the thing you raise alone and imperfectly and with $37 a month and an ironing board wedged between the counter and the wall at 11:15, and it comes out like this. He was not going to say any of this out loud. That was fine. It didn't need to be said out loud to be true. The third Saturday of April moved through its hours. People came and went. The food diminished and was partially replenished by someone who reappeared with a second tray. Marcus's grandfather shook Marcus's hand in the formal way of someone making clear they were proud without knowing exactly how to say it, and Marcus accepted this with the dignity of a boy who understood what was being communicated. Eventually, the room began to thin. Families gathering children and coats, the particular end-of-event energy of a Saturday afternoon reclaiming its own. Emma found Mason near the door and stood beside him, her good shoes now in her hand because she'd decided the event was over, and shoe preservation had resumed. "It went well," she said. "It went well," Mason agreed. Marcus's grandfather cried a little at the trees. "I saw." Marcus pretended not to notice. That was considerate of Marcus. Emma looked at the room, now mostly empty, Patrice already moving chairs back to their weekday positions with the brisk efficiency of a woman who did not allow rooms to stay rearranged longer than necessary. Shelter and Found still on the wall, waiting to be taken down carefully and transported home in the back of the car with Emma supervising the handling. "Can we get something to eat after?" Emma said. "What do you want?" She thought about it. "The place on Carver, the one with the coffee machine that sounds like an animal." "Marcello's." "Yes, he has those sandwiches on Saturdays." "He does." "Okay," Emma said with the finality of someone who has resolved the next item on the agenda. She put her hand in his, not the grip of the frightened, not the reaching of the small, just a hand in a hand, easy and decided. And they stood there for another minute while the room finished emptying out. Outside, through the door that someone had propped open to move chairs, the April sky had made its decision. It was clear. The light was the particular gold of a late Saturday afternoon, low and warm, the kind that made ordinary things look more considered than they were. Mason Carter stood in the doorway of the community center on Delancey Street with his daughter's hand in his and the document in his pocket and all the ordinary weight of his ordinary life, and looked at that light and thought, this is the thing, not any single night or any single act of it, just this. The accumulating weight of being present and doing the work and not requiring it to be recognized. The light on the street, the hand in his hand, the room behind them with the painting still on the wall. He stepped out into the afternoon. Emma stepped with him. They walked toward the car together. 4 blocks, no hurry. And the city moved around them in its usual way, entirely indifferent to the fact that anything had happened, which was exactly right.